Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere, the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowicz.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowicz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Your market is negative this morning. TK, your headline over the weekend. Israel is at war.
There's only one headline this weekend. Bond markets closed. We'll cover this continued bond debacle, but certainly front and center in the news, still happening, according to our people in Tel Aviv. This is a dynamic story on a difficult Monday morning.
Lisa, we have to work through three questions this morning. Where are we now? Where is this going next? And the big one for many, after seeing the brutal, shocking images through the weekend, how on earth did this happen?
Especially because it shook a sense of security, a sense of invincibility, a sense of intelligence, an ability to foresee what was going to happen within Israel. At this point, there is a lot of questions, as well as how far this will percolate in a geopolitical sense, right? I mean, will this ensnare Iran? How this will really affect the Israeli-Saudi Arabia pact that was in the works over the past couple of weeks and months.
Let's turn to the price action briefly. Your equity market pulling back on the S&P 500 by 0.6%. Looking at the foreign exchange market, the dollar is stronger against the euro at 105.33. And there's the move in the oil market, Tom. WTI up by 3.5% at 85.70.
Yeah, I've watched oil as well. And of course, in a day where we're not getting bond information from the United States, maybe it's a little sketchy. But one little tea leaf, John, really captured my attention. And this was stronger Swiss franc. We really haven't seen this in the last number of weeks. And Swiss franc strengthens through 0.96. That's, it's something to watch. That's an indication of the tension that we see in the Levant.
Lots of work being done on the south side just to work out where next in the commodity market. Halima Croft over at RBC, Lisa, rightly pointing to Iran as the wild card in all of this. I believe that Goldman Sachs sticking with that triple-digit crude forecast for next year, and that's where our focus will be through some of this morning.
Halima Croft highlighting the risk that this potentially increases sanctions on Iran from the U.S. and that really is one of the key constraints on supply. There isn't necessarily any disruption seen as of yet, but you have to understand, and this is what everybody is trying to grapple with, if you have true geopolitical risk, true conflict in the Middle East, the major producer of oil, this is going to potentially be disruptive, and people are preparing for that today.
Brent crude, Lisa, 87, WTI 85.70.
It's a big week this week, later in the week when it comes to economic data, CPI, PPI capping the week with JP Morgan and their earnings. Today we do have a host of Fed speak down in Dallas for the NABE conference. Dallas Fed President Lori Logan, Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson, Fed Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr, who I know Tom will be listening to. Curious to hear how they frame what we got on Friday, given the fact that we did get a surprisingly hot number, at least in the headline level. Today, the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh kick off through Sunday. Tom will be heading there later in the week. We did hear from Christine Lagarde today saying that the IMF cut its global forecasts ahead of what was going to be released by tomorrow. And then today, also percolating in the headlines, ongoing strikes, this time in Canada. A deadline almost at midnight for General Motors and Unifor, the Canadian equivalent to UAW, trying to come to some sort of labor agreement, with GM having a factory there and some parts and engine manufacturing areas as well.
Lisa, thank you. Let's turn to our top story. The Israel-Hamas conflict entering the third day with over 1,100 dead. Israeli forces responding with strikes in Gaza after the militant group entered Israel, taking hostages over the weekend. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iranian security officials helped plan what would be the biggest Israeli security failure in decades. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken maintaining they have not seen evidence to confirm cooperation.
There's a long relationship between Iran and Hamas. In fact, Hamas wouldn't be Hamas without the support that it's gotten over many years from Iran. We haven't yet seen direct evidence that Iran was behind this particular attack or involved, but the support over many years is clear.
Joining us now is Norman Rule, Senior Advisor for the Transnational Threats Project at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Norman spent 34 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. Norman, wonderful to catch up with you under tragic circumstances, obviously. Norman, we have to start with the main question that was on the lips of everybody. What happened and how did this happen over the weekend?
Good morning. Israeli security forces, primarily the Shin Bet, have had responsibility for Gaza and the occupied territories, and they have over the years demonstrated a very capable architecture of surveilling Palestinian activity. And this has allowed them to frustrate multiple Palestinian attacks and identify, locate, and when necessary, neutralize Hamas and other Palestinian officials. In this case, it appears that Hamas was able to develop a compartmented planning, execution, and training program within that security bubble that not only evaded Israeli surveillance, but enabled this operation to be undertaken without Israel seeing indicators that this existed. To be clear, this is an intelligence failure by Israel. However, they have a very capable intelligence service and are catching up. And also, to be clear, this is a failure by the international community as well. America and other countries do not cede the protection of their nationals to Israeli security services. And we also did not see the indicators of this event.
Norman, wonderful to have you with us and with your years and years with the CIA. This is not Matt Damon in a movie. This is reality. How do you take over a geography that is 2 times the size of Washington, D.C., and has 2 million people crammed into it? How do you link your intelligence knowledge with the military effort to de-Hamas Gaza?
It's possible, and Israel has done this for some time with Gaza, the West Bank, and for Lebanon. However, you raise an extremely important point. For Israel to consider ground operations or hostage rescue operations, this is one of the most challenging environments on the planet. It's not just that this is a concentrated civilian areas. This is a concentrated civilian area with very tall buildings. Now, the United States and Iraq and Britain have some experience in working this in Iraq and Afghanistan, but these were much smaller areas with much shorter buildings. For Israel, this is an extraordinarily difficult challenge, and no one should underplay the casualty count that is likely to happen for Israelis and Palestinians if ground operations are undertaken.
You look at the narrow like that, and you also look at the bigger. In your writings, you talk of a multipolar dynamic, and you take the tensions of the Middle East and the Levant back to 1870 and 1930, way before 1967 as well. What's the multipolar dynamic that Israel faces right now?
Well, it's a good news, bad news story. You have a situation where on the good news side, there are strategic, long-term, and continuing drivers for the Saudis and for the Emiratis and others to promote regional integration that must include Israel because of its geographic location. That hasn't gone away, and that will sustain the ongoing diplomatic process between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel to restore relations. On the downside, you have a international community that is cracked apart. So pulling together Russia, China, and the European community in a way that actually promotes a peace plan of some consequence will be impossible.
There's also a question about the role of Iran, especially as the Wall Street Journal is reporting that they had an active role in helping to plan this attack. We have not heard from the U.S. government confirming that. They said they are investigating. What are the potential consequences? What is the escalation type of potential if Iran is deemed to have had an active role in planning these attacks?
We should be careful about the report. Iran is unlikely to have played a robust, active role in planning the attack simply because they are not on the ground. They do not have personnel on the ground. They would not be able to provide an intelligence input to those operations, and their involvement would compromise the compartmentation of the operation. However, Iran has provided drones, training, money for over the years, as Secretary Blinken has correctly stated. Hamas would not be Hamas without Iran. But that fits Iran's modus operandi. In essence, what they do is they enable proxies to conduct operations that parallel Iran's strategic objectives. Those operations play out. Iran is able to say it supported them and enabled them. Iran achieves its strategic goals. But Iran's direct hand is not seen, and thus Iran escapes international punishment.
The speculation is that one of the strategic aims was to disrupt the Saudi Arabia-Israeli agreement that was being worked on and coming to some sort of fruition in the next couple of weeks and days. How much do you think that has been iced? How much are people really discussing that aspect of the strategic potential motivation for the timing of this attack?
There's no question that that was likely one of the motivations, but this is a pie that has multiple pieces in it. This operation was clearly developed over many, many months. It would have taken a very long time, if only because of the compartmentation requirements, to pull this together, and therefore it had a number of reasons. The Raisi government and its proxies have maintained an assertive foreign policy posture for a very long time. There was no specific incident that provoked this, but certainly one of the benefits for hardliners in Iran and the proxies is that this will complicate, if not disrupt, the diplomatic process underway.
Norman, we know based on reports they have taken scores of hostages. Does that complicate Israel's response to this?
Hugely. And we should note that these are international hostages. Reports are unconfirmed, but there may be Chinese, French, Thai, as well as American hostages, as well as among the dead in Israel. So this is in many ways a Hamas attack against the international community. These hostages will be dispersed within Gaza. Isolating them and identifying their locations and developing rescue plans will be very, very difficult. The United States has considerable experience here and will no doubt be sending intelligence, security personnel to assist the Israelis, who are also very good at this. This will also inject a considerable amount of complications to diplomacy. So we've watched the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others engage Qatar, Turkey, which have good relations with Hamas, and a variety of actors to see how this plays out. It is not inconceivable that you will have outreach to Iran itself to assist on this. That rarely works out well. We should recall what happened last when Iran had hostages in Lebanon.
Norman, a la Kissinger, Mearsheimer, Robert D. Kaplan, and frankly you, is this a day where America shifts back to real politics? I mean, forget about shuttle diplomacy and all of that. This morning, is it all about a real politic that we think we have forgotten and moved on from?
Well, the line of the Middle East is unlike Las Vegas. What happens in the Middle East never stays in the Middle East. And the Biden administration will need to develop not only a strategy to address this issue, a strategy to see how this impacts existing programs such as the Iran and Saudi and other initiatives, but likewise, they're going to have to staff this out. They're going to have to apply a lot of personnel and policymaker bandwidth, which will come at a cost of other issues. This is a seismic issue, which is going to transform regional policymaking and international policymaking. We're in the early days, and the ripples of this attack in terms of policy and domestic politics are still playing out.
I want to ask you this question to wrap things up, Norman. No speaker in the House, no ambassador to Israel, Egypt, to Lebanon. Is that a symbolic failure, or will that have real-world consequences?
Well, it's certainly a symbolic problem, but we shouldn't discount the capabilities and roles of our chargés in these locations, of intelligence personnel, of military personnel. Those communication channels remain robust, and these capitals often deal directly with the United States in Washington through their very able ambassadors. So the system of handling this is underway and will be executed crisply. It just would be better and easier if these personnel were in place. And Israel has received a considerable boost in the number of Iron Dome interceptors and ammunition it will need. And that has occurred without the House being in order. But we need to fix this.
Norman, thank you for your insight this morning, and hopefully we can catch up again before the end of the week. Norman Rule there of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. TK, they're going to have to staff this out, and fast.
Well, that's the authority there, and that is the key phrase for me in what you heard there from Norman Rule. We will have to staff this out. How many years, how many administrations have we short-staffed all of what we see in the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, that's, to me, the key phrase.
On the market in the next hour, Amy Wu-Silverman of RBC. On policy, Isaac Boltanski of BTIG. And here in New York, AMH a little bit later in the next hour. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
There's a long relationship between Iran and Hamas. In fact, Hamas wouldn't be Hamas without the support that it's gotten over many years from Iran. We haven't yet seen direct evidence that Iran was behind this particular attack or involved, but the support over many years is clear.
Important comments from Secretary of State Antony Blinken over the weekend to ABC. Those comments running counter to what we heard in a report from the Wall Street Journal yesterday evening. The Journal reporting Iranian security officials have planned what would be the biggest Israeli security failure in decades. We'll return to that story in just a moment. If you are just joining us this morning, good morning and welcome to the programme. Your equity market on the S&P looks a little something like this. We're negative by 0.5% on the S&P 500. Treasury market is closed today for Columbus Day. Yields are lower elsewhere, though. I think capturing that risk-off story, yields lower by about 4 basis points on a German 10-year to, let's call it, 2.84. And in the commodity market, Tom, the rally I think we all anticipated, up by 3.5% on WTI, 85.65.
I didn't look at the standard deviation move there, but yeah, jump up in oil. I did look at the standard deviation move in the Israeli shekel, and it was 3.8, which I would think, John, given the angst, is normative, to be polite, and the central bank is acting on that.
To support the currency.
Morning. Yeah, a weaker shekel by 3.8 standard deviations, and that's within the realm of reason.
And a question we're asking this morning, Tom, whether this has the potential to have a broader regional conflict beyond Hamas and Israel.
As a war, the news, and I thought Lisa captured this brilliantly, the idea here of the back and the forth and the news reports and who's got it and who doesn't, that's all secondary to just the sheer fury of day 3 of any kind of war. And I would go geographically off of the wonderful conversation with Norman Rule and look to the north to Hezbollah on the Lebanese border. To me, the idea that this is a one-front war, we learned in 1967, no.
Let's bring in our next guest. Steve Chevron joins us now, Head of Multi-Asset Solutions at Federated Hermes. Steve, a question I think people will be asking in the market is whether this represents a durable headwind to investor sentiment. Do you think it could?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly adds to uncertainty. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, John. I mean, just watching the footage over the weekend, I mean, I know we have a job to do, but I feel like equities are the least important thing considering some of the images we saw over the weekend. I mean, all things being considered, just trying to decipher it, obviously it's an upward pressure on the commodity complex in oil. It adds to uncertainty in the markets. Yeah, you saw bonds rally a little bit, but not anything major. I mean, we've seen Treasury yields go up 10 basis points in a day. A 4 basis point decline in international high quality bonds isn't much. I think the point you just made, though, is the appropriate one. What happens next? And does this spread? Does it become a wider regional conflict? Then that has all kinds of implications. But at this point, we all have to wait and see.
You are wonderful at the cross-asset analysis. This bond debacle that we're in right now, how does it affect Steve Auth? I mean, is he getting his requisite 9 hours sleep a night? How does it affect the world of equities?
So Steve and I are very close. I don't know what he does at night. What I will say is that, there's a lot of, it's a hard one to tell. You've got a yield curve that's uninverting. And historically, when that happens, that's a real imminent sign of recession, but it's never uninverted this way, which is this kind of bearish steepener. It's not like the 2-year yield is falling in anticipation of cuts. You've got a 10-year that's rising. And the question is there a buyer's strike on the Treasury, or is the market trying to normalize to a new normal of a kind of 5 to 6% nominal GDP? And one of those is much more bullish than the other.
Tell me about value versus growth then. I mean, I was shocked on the Exxon Pioneer transaction rumored last week that these are 10 and 12 and 13 multiple companies, where we're talking about the chosen 7 are 25 and 30 multiple companies. How do you define it, Federated growth in value?
Well, just using a simple kind of Russell 1000 growth versus value. Coming into this year, we thought inflation would be a little bit more durable and the Fed would hike more than the market expected. That was right. We thought growth might struggle a little under that environment, and that wasn't. We still think that this market broadens out. We think it broadens out to cyclicals, pricing out some recession risk, at least in the short run. We think the dividend players and their safety are attractive. And so, yeah, we've nibbled on large cap growth on the most recent sell-off because we've been so underweight, but we still think that there's an opportunity for the market to broaden out.
There's a question about how much can change in a minute, given some of the concern that we're seeing percolate out of yet another front for a geopolitical conflagration. How much would your view change should oil sort of bear the brunt of this? If we do see any kind of disruption and we do see oil prices climb above $100 a barrel on a sustainable basis?
Yeah, I mean, look, what the market and the Fed are trying to pull off here is an inside straight to a softer landing. And so anything that makes that path more difficult is a challenge, whether or not that's higher oil prices, resurgent inflation, rising delinquencies, a 10-year yield that becomes unhinged to the upside. Those are all risk factors. And I think what the last year has told us is you want to be humble. You want portfolios that are close to neutral, pointed in the direction of your fundamental view. And so, we think markets are a little bit upside biased here, or certainly before the weekend. But you want to stay close to neutral and humble because there's a lot of risk factors out here that are really unprecedented.
Citi this morning saying the conflict in Israel to come as a stagflationary shock to the Israeli economy. Could you say the same thing about the global economy right now, given what you're seeing elsewhere?
Well, it's certainly possible. But again, I think what has to happen there to be a real stagflationary event is you need to draw on some of the northern countries, or you need a tax on Iranian refineries or things of that nature. There's probably not enough of an oil price shock where things are located today, but a spreading of that certainly can. And again, look, on this theme of humility, John, if you would have asked me, what would have happened in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, who would have gotten the market reaction right? And so we're not experts in these areas, and we stick to the fundamentals as best as we can.
It's one of those mornings where you can learn something about how the market is responding to this incoming information and events over the weekend. In some ways, it's a shame the cash treasury market is closed today. Are we learning that bonds still provide those risk mitigation characteristics on a morning like this morning?
There's no question about that. Every time that bonds as a downside protection mechanism have been doubted, they show up. And so, look, I mean, unless we're looking at some, massively secular buyer's strike, and I think it's premature to say that, I think when there's trouble in the world, the safest asset is the United States Treasury, and I don't think anything's changed about that. And I think we'll probably see that tomorrow.
What are you watching as this sort of progresses over the next hours and days, as we read all of the news and how it's potentially spreading or being contained? What are you looking for to potentially change your outlook one way or another?
Well, again, I think, spreading north, whether it's Lebanon or whether there's any kind of direct involvement with the Iranians, would certainly be something to watch. I think in addition, if you start to see, I don't know how to say this, but if you see kind of any terrorist activity in non-Middle Eastern countries, that's something that certainly could shake confidence in the world, and you watch closely. And then honestly, Lisa, more than anything, it's just watching in horror at the atrocities that are going on and feeling heartbroken about it.
Just truly shocking. Steve, thank you, sir. Thanks for the insight this morning. Steve Chevron there of Federated Hermes. TK, I think straight away it was Ian Bremmer of Eurasia calling this Israel's 9/11.
Yeah, Ian, as usual, no surprise, did a great job. And what he did here, folks, and is what we'll do at Bloomberg News all through the weeks to come, is to try to give scope and scale. And what Dr. Bremmer did is he said, here's a population of America, here's a population of Israel, compare and contrast 1,000 whatever dead, and it is a scale of war.
We have to consider then, Tom, whether this would represent a paradigm shift for the region as big as 9/11 more than 20 years ago.
I'm not expert on that. John, I'm just not going to go there. What I am going to say is everything shifts frankly, from Russia, but I would certainly say from Erdogan and Turkey down around and across all of northern Africa. It is a titanic shift of tone.
We don't know how it spreads, right? And this is sort of the key question, which is the couple of days to come, we're going to have maybe a better sense of what a ground operation looks like and exactly how this does potentially act as a paradigm shift in the region. But that is the uncertainty, I think, that people are responding to when you can see the price change in oil, because you have to imagine this kind of instability in the heart of really oil producing global production. You have to think this is going to have some sort of ramification.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, a little more than a week ago, the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. It is not quiet anymore. Coming up a little bit later, Isaac Boltanski of BTIG in the next hour, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie in a studio here in New York. From New York City, equities lower. This is Bloomberg. Equities falling this morning. We're negative on the S&P 500, down across the board worldwide. We're down by about 0.5% on the S&P, following the best week of gains on the S&P 500 since the 1st of September. On the Nasdaq, pulling back by about 0.7%. Turn to the bond market, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year. In the German bond market, yields lower a couple of basis points with the Treasury market close. We're down 2 or 3 basis points to about 2.86 on a 10-year in Germany, down 2 or 3 basis points on a 2-year as well at 3.1%. I don't think this is a judgment on anything at all at the moment, Tom, with regards to inflation or monetary policy.
Yeah.
This is just one of those knee-jerk reactionary moves where you go to the perceived haven of sovereign bonds, and apparently based on this price action, the perceived haven of bonds still exists.
Yeah, my tea leaf is to look at Euro Swissy here. You can look at the German bonds, which are price up, yield down. But in the equity market, again, with a dearth of disinformation, I would suggest a bracketed VIX under 20, 19.06. Yes, it's up a stick. 1.6% is a big stick. But the answer is equities are, I would say, John, bracketed given the geopolitical tensions.
Textbook risk aversion this morning across the board from asset class to asset class. Turn to foreign exchange, the euro weaker, the dollar a whole lot stronger, the euro against the dollar snapping 11 weeks of euro weakness. The euro against the dollar right now is 105.26. We're negative by 0.6%. Under surveillance this morning, the death toll from the conflict between Israel and the militant group Hamas topping 1,100, with fighting continuing into a third day. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iran helped plot the attack on Israel, Iran denying that report, while US Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying, Lisa, they haven't seen any evidence of Tehran's involvement.
This is the key question, is how does this expand? How does this escalate? Because we are expecting to get some information about what the next steps are from Israel in terms of some sort of potential ground operation, but also the threat of retaliatory attacks to Iran, which has long been known to be a sponsor of Hamas. So there are all of these questions percolating. And this morning, I would look less at the price reaction and more at just everyone scanning the news to try to understand what the next shoe is to drop, to understand how this evolves.
And what's so important here is not so much the diplomacy in talking about Iran and that. I'm going to go back to June 10th, 1967, John. I remember this very, very clearly in high school. Here's the exact quote from NPR's History. War ends with Israel claiming the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal. There was a shock then as they took over Gaza Strip from Egypt's protection. And that's where the tension began in 1967. And it has just been a struggle for all, every second for all since then.
Just getting an update from the Israel Defense Forces. Israel's army plans to call up 300,000 reserve soldiers to fight. This according, Tom, to the IDF moments ago.
And with some losses already, including some senior military officers, I'm by no means expert on that. We'll have Anne-Marie Horton with us here, John, in a bit. I think she's far more up to speed on this than any of us.
In the next hour, about 30 minutes away. An update elsewhere as well. The Bank of Israel moving to support markets in the wake of the attack, announcing it will sell foreign exchange for the first time since it allowed the shekel to trade freely. The central bank will sell as much as $30 billion and extend up to $15 billion through swap mechanisms. Elsewhere, House Majority Leader Chuck Schumer criticizing China's stance on the conflict during a meeting between President Xi Jinping and delegation of US senators. I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn the cowardly and vicious attacks upon them. I say this with respect, Lisa, but I was disappointed by the foreign minister's statement showing no sympathy or his support for the Israeli people during these tragedies.
And then he did speak with Xi Jinping after making these comments. At least that was the report. We are talking about a situation where I believe the Chinese statement said they urged peace and a two-state solution and did not necessarily condemn the attacks in and of themselves. There is a curious thing here, is that this is coming at a time of trying to normalize relations between the U.S. and China. And what I find interesting about this is we have all these different geopolitical tensions, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's China. Where does this take away from, right? In other words, where does this distract from? How does this add into all of the other tensions that have been percolating?
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Tom, in China at a difficult time. Let's see how she responds to that criticism earlier on this morning.
Well, and globally as well. I think everyone has to respond here. I'm fascinated how Erdogan responds to this. I think that's, to the north, it will be just amazing to see, particularly going from Erdogan of 2002, John, out to the 2 or 3 Erdogans we have seen, and what's the next Erdogan, how he's going to respond to this. And I don't have an answer.
What a difficult time, Tom.
Yeah.
Just on Friday, I think we thought we'd wake up on Monday talking about payrolls still. That big move in the bond market.
Well, this is the
that's
shock.
just not part of the conversation at all.
Hey, let's take 3 seconds here before we get to our good guest on economics. And John, a worthy this weekend stated that so much of the manpower of Israel was over on the West Bank, off to the east towards Jordan, where the challenges that Israel has in the West Bank, and was the Gaza Strip territory undermanned and being surveyed by technology. That's not me saying that. That's from someone of some great expertise.
News becomes dated so quickly. The weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal, Tom, front page. The Saudis could be boosting output into next year off the back of the Israeli-Saudi pact.
And getting in the way, yeah.
Already talking about that breaking down and not happening almost immediately.
Well, we'll have to see. We'll continue to watch the story. And again, we're keyed on Amory Horton joining us here in the next hour. On economics, on our central banks at Aberdeen and the United Kingdom, Abigail Watt joins us this morning, research economist. Abigail, you do such a good job of synthesizing any and all. I'm going to begin with the base assumption that Israel, Hamas, is removed from the dynamics of our economics, but it does speak to a confidence within the system as tested by the bond market in the last 2 weeks. What is the measure of central bank confidence right now that they can assist, that they can do something?
I think you're right to kind of point to the way in which this would feed into our economic thinking. I think there's a few ways in which I would see consequences from the fallout of this. And I think, as a number of your guests have said, the extent to which this broadens out is into kind of other regions is kind of critical in terms of the extent to which this might feed through into, for example, higher oil prices. You know, that is something that we have been watching in terms of the context of higher headline inflation. And I think that does matter, you know, for while central banks might look through some supply shocks on the energy price side, I do think that the extent to which that persists might impact the broader kind of price basket, given the input costs for goods production and services production. So I think the extent to which we see oil prices remaining elevated, that's the angle that I think we would be thinking about.
To me,
in terms of the economic consequences.
To me, the key debate is the real yield. Is the real yield generally across 4 or 5 central banks at a tipping point, or is it just a trajectory to a higher level?
I think that's an absolutely critical question. I think there's a number of elements to kind of think about in terms of the first would be, I guess, higher for longer. I think we've seen, you know, some of the repricing in bond markets is around this messaging from central banks. And I think that has been one of coordination across the major DM central banks around the idea that although policymakers might be reaching the kind of end of their hiking cycles, it is the case that they're not in an environment in which they feel comfortable to begin to kind of cut rates back again. And then I think the other element that kind of matters for that is kind of what's happening on that inflation side. And I think the question as to whether we continue to see this kind of disinflation trend continuing, or whether you see kind of some stalling and perhaps the progress on the inflation side begins to moderate in the coming months.
There's been a lot of discussion, Abigail, over the weekend about the parallels to 50 years ago. The month that the Yom Kippur War took place, the parallels have been drawn for a whole host of reasons, not only because of the oil shock and the potential for stagflation to take hold in a more meaningful way. Do you think that the parallels that go beyond just oil are applicable to the moment that we're in?
I think it's an interesting comparison. I think currently, the key concern for us actually in the U.S. economy is domestically generated inflation, and I think that's actually what the Fed has been focused on so squarely as well. Looking at the core basket, looking at kind of core services in particular, and some of the stickiness there. And I think the data that we had out last week, and I know obviously events of the weekend have overtaken some of the kind of focus on that payrolls number, but I do think that kind of continued upside surprise in some of the labor market data is something that the Fed will be looking at closely. And I think that domestically generated inflation is actually probably a core focus just now.
We will get CPI on Wednesday and then PPI on Thursday to feed that. The moment at hand, though, does raise a question of how central banks can respond to geopolitical risk, how governments can. Fiscal authorities at a time where spending is constrained, borrowing costs are high, and inflation is still a threat, which really prohibits just a rapid knee-jerk cutting of rates. How does that factor into how you see this evolving on an economic level?
I think it's a really good point. I think that kind of focus, as I said, on domestically generated inflation, on the kind of issues at home that many economies are facing, does, as you say, kind of impact the ability of kind of central banks or governments to kind of put through kind of funding and support for such issues. I think one of the things, obviously we've seen the dysfunction in recent weeks in the US Congress and in the House in particular. And I think that is something that I guess is a concern ongoing around the ability to kind of react to some of these fast moving events.
Abigail Watt 101. Let's do it right now. Price down, yield up. You at Aberdeen knows this. There's been a bond market bloodbath. There's no other way to put it. How does that constrain the degrees of freedom, the flexibility of major central banks?
I think it's a fair point, and I think this was something that Daley was getting at in her speech last week. When she was speaking, she talked about the idea that you've seen financial conditions tighten sufficiently to be equivalent to perhaps that final rate hike that the Fed has in its dot plot. We think that the November meeting is very finely balanced. We think there is a possibility that they could hike, given the strength of the economic data that we've seen, given the likelihood that we see that GDP data that's coming out just ahead of that meeting, coming in kind of well above trend, given kind of current tracking estimates. I think the question for central banks is how much does this kind of tightening in financial conditions, given the moves in bond markets, offset the need to do kind of further policy action? I think that's the kind of key thing for central banks and how they'll be reading that.
Abigail, thank you for your insight this morning. Thank you very much. Abigail Watt there of Aberdeen. The latest on the Israel-Hamas conflict entering day 3, the death toll topping 1,100. The latest in the last hour, Lisa. According to the Israel Defense Force, Israel's army plans to call up 300,000 reserve soldiers to fight. That again, Bramo, according to the IDF this morning. And you really pointed out a really important point, which is that their efforts are really complicated by the hostages, which do raise the specter of a ground operation. Also, at the same time, Israeli Defense Forces said that it cannot deny that Hamas militants may still be entering the Israeli territory through some of the breached areas. So there is a question of stabilizing the south, let alone entering the next phase. This coming, as you know, Lisa, just as we were on the brink of a pact between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This came from Israel's ambassador to the UN over the weekend. There are moderate countries in our region that want to normalize relations and live in peace and coexistence. And definitely Saudi Arabia is part of them. There was a feeling over the weekend that I think you can take a massive step back from that happening anytime soon. But I think that leaves it on the table just from Israel over the weekend. That's what Israel is saying. That's what the U.S. is saying. Saudi Arabia has put out a statement trying to support some sort of two-state solution, and also saying that part of the situation was part of the reason for this. Mm-hmm. That said, you had Israeli officials coming out and say what they say officially and what they're saying behind closed doors are two different things. And you definitely feel that kind of geopolitical tension within some of these nations as they try to finesse their messaging. I would, as people are getting up to speed in the story, John, I would not underestimate the immediacy of 3 days or beginning of 3 days of action. We can publish 1,000 dead, but the scope and scale, 1967, 1,000 Israelis died. 1973, maybe 3,000. We're well on our way to those kind of statistics quickly. Shocking is a word we'll use certainly more than once this morning. Just absolutely shocking. Coming up next on the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., Isaac Boltanski of BTIG. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
When I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks.
The President of the United States over the weekend following those tragic attacks on Israel. From New York City this morning, good morning to you. Equities negative by 0.5 on the S&P 500. First look this morning, obviously in the commodity market, looking at crude, WTI 85.91 and by 3.8%. Tom, we're looking at the Brent crude price this morning, 87.65, up by 3.6%.
It's a nice lift there on a percentage basis. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. And, I guess it goes, and I'm going to act like I'm pretend to Javier Blas. It comes back to the Suez Canal, which has been part of these tensions. And even though Egypt is perhaps sidelined from this war, the Suez Canal is close, and that will definitely affect the oil price.
Front and centre Iran, Tom. Halima Croft of RBC talked a lot about her research over the years, talking about it a lot this morning. Whether Israel directly implicates Iran. The Wall Street Journal, to some degree, did yesterday with its reporting. We've not heard that confirmed by the US administration. And Tom, we haven't really heard that confirmed by Israel either.
Yeah, the confirmation's not out there yet, but yet is there. I mean, we have to remember we're 2.5 days entering a third day into this. I'm not all that concerned about it, other than the persistency of what Iran has been doing. Not only, and again, I mentioned this, John, I think it's really important for people getting up to speed on the geography. This is a two-front war, and I'm sure Israel's maybe a three-front war, but certainly to the north, Lebanon and Hezbollah, it's front and center as they focus on the south and Gaza Strip.
We need to talk about America's response to it, or potential response, the dysfunction at home. We've talked a lot about a speakerless house. Tom, based on my understanding of things, no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon. And the list goes on, by the way. The list goes on.
Smartest thing I've heard this morning was Norman Rule. We have to staff up. Maybe we have to staff up here on our military. Let's get to it with Isaac Boltansky, Policy Research Director at BTIG, with an understanding that the United States of America is not staffed up. Isaac, there is a photograph of Lyndon Baines Johnson talking to Abba Eban in 1967. You can feel the fear in the room. The good news is they had a Speaker of the House to legislate off of in John McCormack. We are fractured. How serious is the fact that America in 2023 is not the America of 1967?
Yeah, well, three things come to mind, Tom. Number one is I agree with the notion that it's time to staff up, but I would posit that the time to staff up was probably before this. It was weeks and months ago when we had time to do so. We have held up dozens of military appointments in the Senate. We have no ambassador to Israel, as you mentioned. There are numerous meaningful appointments across the U.S. government, especially in foreign policy, that remain vacant for what have largely been petty or parochial reasons. And so that's point number one. You will see the Senate move quickly for some of these nominees, but even the Senate moving quickly means we got to wait a few weeks. Number two, when we think about the House, it is a little bit silly to talk about petty personal politics with what's going on in the world, putting it into perspective. But that's what we're going to have this week. And right. I'm not wholly convinced that we're going to get a speaker by the end of this week.
Come on, Isaac, you've lived this, and I've lived it too, off the fields of Ohio and onto the West. There's an American isolationist streak that says the Eastern Mediterranean is not our business. Define modern isolationism in your Washington.
Modern isolationism is that we do not have to be involved unless it impacts us directly. Of course, this will impact us directly. And I can tell you that the White House does have its kid gloves on when it comes to Iran at the moment. I think you mentioned this before, in part because it's trying to figure out what's going to happen with the prices of oil. And I think that crude dynamic is crude, but it's something that we're going to see playing a larger and larger part of this discussion when it comes to sanctions. What happens with Saudi Arabia and Iran when they get pulled into this more and more? What are we going to do with Iran when they're more directly implicated? What does that do for Saudi Arabia, who was already showing some signs of a willingness to increase production next year? And so, look, all of these things are playing into a White House who was already thinking about what it wants to do as it begins its campaign run, how it's going to try to expand Bidenomics in a way that can hopefully appeal to more voters. So, look, the calculus here gets more complicated by the second.
Let's talk about the immediate need for aid, Isaac. Our ability to provide that aid in this country, is it curtailed by the absence of people in key positions?
Look, the simple reality here is that Congress can do whatever it wants when there is a majority. And so we talk about in the Senate, we talk about the Byrd rule and the procedural limitations. And in the House, we talk about how limited Speaker pro tem is. The reality is, if there is a majority in either chamber or supermajority, they can do whatever they want. They're not going to until we have more clarity on the Speaker. And I think that this is going to be a wasted week on Capitol Hill because we are going to waste it trying to find a Speaker without any guarantee that we will have one. My gut tells me that we may have to wait until next week with Speaker Pro Tem McHenry leading the House in order to actually start talking about providing more aid both to Ukraine and to Israel, because those two, John, are getting wrapped up together now.
Isaac, that's the House. Let's discuss the Senate. Senator Paul, Senator Tuberville have been holding up key positions for a while now. Are they embarrassed this morning, embarrassed into stepping aside? Not stepping aside from their position, but stepping aside to make sure those appointments can go through?
Look, I think that there is going to be I think the way that we should expect it on their end is a tactical retreat. They're not going to pull back from their positions. They believe that they are righteous in stopping those nominations. But I think that you will see the White House and even members of their own party implore them to allow some of the more strategically significant appointments to get through.
Isaac, you said something interesting about how Ukraine and Israel aid are getting tied together. There's a question of whether there will be an opening up of funds to Israel that will then mean more funds to Ukraine or fewer funds to Ukraine. How are you viewing that discussion as it really evolves, particularly in the House?
Yeah, look, I think that it's very clear that getting money to Ukraine has become incredibly more difficult. The politics around it have become tougher for a number of reasons. And the one that I continue to hear when I talk to staffers and lawmakers is there's no clear strategic end, right? What are we hoping for from all of our assistance to Ukraine? Is it pushing back to the Donbass? Is it Crimea? What is the strategic goal here? And so what I expect, and the way that the Hill usually works, is you create a snowball that rolls downhill and captures everything so that it's harder to vote against it. And so when we start thinking about what that type of package looks like, I think it includes Ukraine funding with some sort of guidance around what that funding should be used for, some sort of save face for those lawmakers who are concerned, as well as Israel support and even FEMA funding. You build something like that, it's very hard to vote against.
Just curious, Isaac, to wrap this all together and sort of end the hour where we began, I'm curious what you think about the intelligence failures and how you'd interpret that, not only from Israel, but globally from the U.S.'s perspective, and what went wrong here.
Look, I think all of us, first and foremost, our thoughts are with those who are affected and what is still ongoing, as you mentioned, on the ground there. But I have to tell you, throughout the conversations this weekend, time and time again, it came back to the fact that an operation of this scale doesn't get done without there being observable dynamics at play beforehand. And there's deep concern that there was intelligence failure in Israel and on our side as well that is scaring people. And I think that, that's something that's going to be of deep focus in the months afterwards. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see this become a public part of the conversation, because it does seem like the scale of the failure here is meaningful and historic.
Isaac, thank you, sir. I think it already is a big part of the conversation. Isaac Boltanski there of BTIG. Let's wrap up the next hour on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. We'll catch up with Anne-Marie Hordern, AMH, our chief Washington correspondent here in New York, to break down some of these issues. Pushing beyond that, Tom, we'll hear from Ellen Wald, the senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, on what's happening in this commodity market and the breakdown potentially between Saudi Arabia and Israel at a time where we thought we might be close to a pact between the two nations.
There are different undercurrents here, and what's important is this is not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It seems like this is going to have a significant length of time, and Anne-Marie particularly is a nerd to that. With all of her work off of the London desk, she understands the timeline of these things. Are not, 1967, Six-Day War. John, that was a 6-day war of convenience. This is not going to be 6 days.
And we're curious about how this really does evolve and escalate through the region, John. I think we're all watching that very closely.
Without a doubt. Equities this morning, negative 0.6% on the S&P. In the commodity market, crude higher by 3.8% on WTI, up by 3.6% on Brent crude, getting closer to $90, $87 and around about 70 cents. From New York, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie, up next.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
We chose the peaceful path to achieve our rights, but Israel continued using blunt force against Palestinian lives and Palestinian rights.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowicz.
Tragic pictures over the weekend. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowicz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Your equity market negative by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Tom, the conflict between Israel and Hamas entering day 3.
It's day 3, and it's the top of the list because it's extremely dynamic right now. We're looking at the headlines coming out moment by moment, summaries of the action, if you will, in the Gaza Strip. And frankly, outside the Gaza Strip is just as important. And of course, the diplomacy or non-diplomacy through the day. Day 3 has got to be front and center.
Day 3, and I think for a third day asking the same question. Elise, we've asked it all morning. How did this happen?
And one thing that we were just hearing from Isaac Boltansky is it wasn't just an intelligence failure by Israel, but also by the United States, by the other allies. How is this not picked up? And it's raised questions about security on a whole host of fronts as people look toward potential escalation. Will Israel come out and blame Iran directly? And what does that mean for the geopolitics of an already fraught region?
Well, yeah, and buried in the news flow this weekend is the idea of what does Israel do as a direct confrontation with Iran. And they certainly have the capabilities to do that, but it's in the category now, John, unimaginable is how I would put that, and yet people are trying to put a probability on that.
In the immediate aftermath, we were thinking about a full ground invasion. Tom, now you're starting to ask the question, I think over the last 24 hours, whether hostages, the scores of hostages that Hamas has taken, complicates that effort.
It complicates it immensely, and it's an international. Steve Strauss just had out on Twitter, I believe it's 10, I'm guessing folks from Nepal who have been taken in some form of hostage. So it's a multinational hostage set. But I would go back to our initial insight in the 6 o'clock hour, which is the geography of this. You get 2 million people crammed into an area that is 2 times the size of Washington, D.C. I think that's something we can grab on. This is not urban warfare. It's highly congested territory that Israel's talking about, quote unquote, taking.
One of the most densely populated parts of the world on the planet, Tom. Let's turn to the price action, give you a snapshot of how the market's responding to some of this. In the equity market at the moment, we're negative by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Futures pulling back. The bond market, the treasury market, is closed today. So we'll turn to the German bond market just to show yields coming in just a touch by a basis point at 287. All eyes are on crude as soon as that market opened up. It's a move of about 4% on WTI, Lisa. Let's call it $86 on WTI, and Brent crude right now close to 88.
And John, you said earlier, it's kind of amazing to think that we thought that we would come in and talk about payrolls and how much has changed over the weekend. Some of the details of this week are getting de-emphasized in favor of what you're talking about, people just scouring the headlines. Today, though, for those who are following the sort of normal role of economic information, Fed Speak includes Dallas Fed President Lori Logan, Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson, Fed Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr. Then today, we do have the kickoff of the World Bank IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh. They do go through Sunday. A curious question around how they may weigh in on this, where they may provide aid. And this comes after Christine Lagarde came out and noted that the IMF has cut its global growth forecasts, the one that they're going to release tomorrow. And meanwhile, there is yet another deadline for some of the auto worker strikes, 11:59 p.m. today, this time in Canada against General Motors, basically trying to get some sort of agreement similar to the one that they got from Ford. There's also some sort of strike at a Volkswagen Volvo Mack Trucks factory in the United States by the UAW. You can see GM shares lower by 1.3%. John.
Lisa, thank you. Our top story this morning, the Israel-Hamas conflict entering its third day with over 1,100 dead. Israeli forces responding with strikes in Gaza after the militant group entered Israel, taking hostages over the weekend. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iranian security officials helped plan what would be the biggest Israeli security failure in decades. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken maintaining they have not seen evidence to confirm the cooperation.
There's a long relationship between Iran and Hamas. In fact, Hamas wouldn't be Hamas without the support that it's gotten over many years from Iran. We haven't yet seen direct evidence that Iran was behind this particular attack or involved, but the support over many years is clear.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Anne-Marie, our chief Washington correspondent. MH, good to see you. How that point there evolves, that very specific point about Iran's direct involvement, does that hold the keys to how this escalates and whether this turns into a broader regional conflict?
That's one of the main points. But remember, Iran has a number of groups in the region, proxy groups that it backs. It's not just Hamas, it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's the Houthis as well. But direct confrontation with Iran, say Israel were to attack, if these reports from the Wall Street Journal were to be true, that would stem a much wider regional conflict. We should note, I've talked to a lot of people over the weekend, and I've yet had anyone on the phone say to me, or in person say to me, that Iran was directly involved. Of course, we all know for years Iran has backed and supported and funded Hamas, but directly involved, a lot of people have thrown a lot of cold water to me on that fine point.
What a difference a week makes. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just last week. The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. How did they miss this? How did we miss this?
Huge intelligence failure, I would say more so on the Israeli side. They have supposedly informants in Gaza. They have this huge border security wall in Gaza. This is a group that they have infiltrated, and to Norman Rowell's point in your 6 o'clock hour, they were obviously, what Hamas was doing was using something that was really outside of the normal structure to make sure that they could, in fact, execute on this attack. It is a huge security failure. That's going to be looked at secondary at the moment. What Israel's doing right now is they are mobilizing 300,000 Israeli soldiers. That's what the Jerusalem Post says. This is the biggest conscription they have ever seen, and they were announcing that this morning. So what leads to next is likely potentially a ground invasion, something we've not seen in decades in Gaza. And the broader implications are really going to be paramount. I think when people say this is a 9/11 moment, not just for the shock and awe of what happened on the ground in Israel, but the fact that this is now going to spread. This can affect everything, including next year's presidential election.
Yeah, look here, Emery, you and I talked about this over the weekend, and we're all getting up to speed, and particularly of a certain vintage. Palestine is Yasser Arafat. He died in 2004. How do you identify, or more importantly, how does President Biden identify whom to speak to that represents Palestine?
Well, Hamas is not the Palestinian Authority. It's very different. Hamas owns the Gaza Strip. This is different than, say, the West Bank. What the Biden administration will likely do is put a lot of pressure on, say, Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, on Turkey. These are the groups that have direct lines of communication and house, as well, officials from Hamas. That is going to be how they likely are going to be able to extract hostages. And the hostages at this point, could be from a number of countries. These are not just Israelis. Over the weekend, you heard U.S. officials talk about likely Americans are part of that hostage. Norman Rowell talked about he thought a Thai individual was there, a Chinese national was potentially there. So there's also could be potential international pressure coming from around the world when a hostage is taken in Hamas, somewhere hiding in Gaza, likely in a tunnel. It is not just going to be Washington, D.C. that's going to exert that pressure.
You said that this may affect the presidential election. We've got a long way to go before we get there. And there's a question about how the hands of the U.S. and potential aid will be tied by the fact that we don't have a House Speaker. As I mentioned, we don't have an ambassador to Israel. We don't have a whole number of key positions that have been filled already preparing for this. How much does that really interfere with the U.S.'s ability to respond?
So on the ground in Israel, and the former Israeli ambassador was on CNN yesterday, today, Tom Nides, and he was talking about their charge d'affaires doing an excellent job. We have a very big posting in Israel. These are people who have been doing this job for years. And a lot of work that gets done with the Middle East happens actually in Washington, D.C. It's the Saudi ambassador, it's the Qatari ambassador that have direct dialogue with the White House. When it comes to what's happening with the House at the moment, there is no speaker. And what you hear from Patrick McHenry, who's the interim speaker, is that the only thing he can bring to the floor is a speaker vote. He cannot bring legislation. But Tony Blinken yesterday put a little bit of cold water on the fact that they wouldn't be able to send Israel the goods they need. We already know that they're sending warships, but also there was a memorandum signed under the Obama administration that every year there'd be $3.8 billion of security assistance sent to Israel. That likely that's something they can use and draw from. But yes, it does create a bit of paralysis, and obviously dysfunction in Washington doesn't help when there's national security concerns.
One thing that I do want to get your view on, just before we even get to that presidential debate and what the political implications are in the U.S., is how to understand some of the statements coming out of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the like. They've all been critical of Israel, saying that Israel created the situation. And yet there still is this feeling from Israel that the Saudi Arabia deal is still on the table. Do you have any insight in how to understand the position of some of the nations like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like Qatar?
I think what we need to do is look at what they're doing optically in terms of press releases. They will continuously stand by Palestinian people. They all have a domestic audience as well. At the same time, you should look at who their phone calls, what they're doing in terms of their phone calls. I believe there's a number of phone calls, at least one or two, between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Saudi counterpart over the weekend. The diplomacy will be happening behind the scenes. It will not be in the press statements when you see these Arab countries. And yes, obviously, normalization talks are going to hit a massive pause from this, but I don't think they're done. I don't think normalization talks are done forever. The big issue, of course, was part of the normalization talks, and Mohammed bin Salman said this to Brett Baer in that Fox News interview. He actually didn't, I mean, they continually call for a Palestinian state, but what he said was about the life of Palestinians. There would have to be repercussions, or the Saudis would have to give, the Israelis would have to give concessions to Palestinian individuals for them to have a better life. How do you do that when there is a state of war between Gaza and Israel?
It's unthinkable that Israel will now provide concessions, given the events over the weekend, surely.
At this moment, yes. But also you have to look, Gaza is also different from, potential dialogue and diplomacy with the West Bank.
AMH, stay close. Stay close. If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. I want to turn to the price action just briefly. A quick look on what's happening in the commodity market. Crude up by 3.8%, 85.93 on WTI. Brent crude rallying as well. Equities just a little lower. On the S&P 500, negative here by 0.6%. AMH, we've talked a lot this morning about the lack of a speaker, the lack of an ambassador in Israel, Lebanon, Egypt. The list goes on and on and on. We've touched a little bit on Schumer as well, the Senate Majority Leader being over in China, disappointed with Xi Jinping's response to all of this. Where is China in all of this?
They put out a statement that just talked about this conflict basically in the realm of the bigger toxic hostilities you have seen between Palestinians and Israel. Didn't actually come out and condemn the massacre of Israelis and others that we saw over the weekend. So Xi Jinping had this meeting with these bipartisan senators, and because of what happened over the weekend, this became a top priority for Schumer and what he wanted to discuss in the dialogue. This was supposed to be a meeting about a ton of other issues, but then it became about this conflict.
How do we project into the region? The phrase I've used this morning is we have to staff up. What are you going to see from the Biden administration in the next 2 days?
Potentially, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will have some sort of trip to the region.
Show of diplomacy.
Show of diplomacy. We're sending warships as well. There will be a huge show of military force. This will not go unnoticed in the region.
AMH, thank you. Anne-Marie on the latest, our chief Washington correspondent. Coming up later on this hour, we'll catch up with Ellen Wald of the Atlantic Council on the politics of the Middle East and the reaction, Tom, in the crude market.
Absolutely perfect. This is going to be an important interview on petroleum here, up a couple dollars, $88 a barrel on Brent.
Brent crude up 3.5%, WTI up 3.7%. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg.
The ongoing events in Israel over the past few days are horrific. I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn these cowardly and vicious attacks. I was very disappointed, to be honest, by the foreign ministry statement that showed no sympathy or support for Israel during these tough, troubled times.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer speaking in Beijing ahead of today's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, expressing his disappointment and criticising China over the foreign minister's statement, showing no sympathy, in his words, or support for the Israeli people during these tragedies. More on that in just a moment. Here's the price action. The equity market moving lower on the S&P 500, negative 0.6% on the S&P. Yields totally unchanged in Germany. There was a bit of a haven demand story, money flowing into the perceived safety of bonds in places like Germany. The Treasury market, of course, closed today. 2.88 is the yield on a German 10-year. The crude rally continues, Tom. WTI up by 3.7%. Similar move on Brent. WTI crude just south of $86.
With U.S. bond market close, I'd also say the haven of Swiss franc speaks volumes. These are little four-digit ticks, John. I don't want to oversell it, but certainly Swiss franc confirms attention this morning.
Bracing for what's next.
Yeah.
Seems to be the stance this morning.
What is next? And the answer is, to me, it's the sun and the night, and it's day 3 of a war. And, it's a little bit like February of 2 years ago in Ukraine.
A targeted response, a broader regional conflict, a full ground invasion.
As Lisa says, the geography's, the optionality is just off the chart.
We don't know.
We'll have to see. Futures, negative 28. Right now on the markets, Amy Silverman joins us, head of derivatives, RBC Capital Markets, here this morning. How does the bond debacle, I've got on real Bloomberg Total Return Index, I got a 10 standard deviation move. Whatever it is, the number doesn't matter. The answer is you've got to deal with this strange mathematical word, magnitude. How does the magnitude of the move change your equity calculus?
Good morning. I've been thinking about that all weekend. Look, when we came into this weekend, the tails in the market, the standard deviation of skew in the market was quite low. And that's been true for the last few years outside of the regional bank crisis. And obviously that's going to change. I would say that options markets are notoriously bad at pricing geopolitical risk. We've seen that time and time again, but the first thing it tends to do is overreact. So I do think you see that spike in volatility. But what I will tell you is we've seen big tech act as a safe haven. If that does happen, that's going to start muting your volatility again, because that's actually what we did see February 2 years ago. And I'd be curious to see if that follows through this time around.
Percolating in the zeitgeist this morning of Wall Street quant research is the idea that if you have higher yields, it solves its problem. And yields come in because higher yields beget that kind of move. Do you buy it for a minute?
So it's interesting. The way we've been monitoring it is through TLT, so the 20-year proxy of the ETF. And that put skew is extremely high. I'll tell you 2 nuances to it, Tom. The first is all the rate sensitivity ETFs, like your XLU, like your consumers, those have dropped in skew outside of this weekend, but that never happened in TLT. So essentially what it's telling you is that nervousness, that demand for downside in TLT, which we're using as a proxy, has not changed, even with the moves we saw last week.
As we talk, there are a whole host of unknowns people waking up to, are looking at every headline and trying to understand whether this will broaden into a wider regional conflict that could cause oil prices to spike and generally cause some sort of stagflationary cycle that people are hearkening back to the 1970s with. How much can you see a positioning shift preparing for this? I mean, I'm curious from your vantage point how that's even traded or imagined, or whether people aren't even going there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think 2 things. I think it's helpful today that the bond markets are actually closed, because essentially what you're going to see is the equity in a vacuum response. So we'll see what happens with energy. We'll see what happens with the rate-sensitive ETFs, but we actually won't get the response until Tuesday from rates itself. I think what you're going to get positioning-wise is people who have done well this year, who've participated starting from that NVIDIA blowout earnings, saying, perhaps now there is a reason to hedge, because we're not just talking about this kind of orderly sell of possibility from higher rates. We're actually talking about tail events, those unknown unknowns that were not priced into the market prior to this.
Are you getting a lot of calls from people trying to understand how to view this through a lens of protection? Are you getting a lot of sense that investors are watching this with nervousness?
Yeah, yes, and I think I will continue to, because what you've seen so far this year is hedging has been very stratified. You haven't seen it on the broad market level. You haven't seen it on S&P. You haven't really seen it on VIX or IWM. You've seen it in just the utility space or just the home builder space, just Canada. But what I think we'll see is the question of, does it make sense to have a broad-based hedge right now, given these geopolitical risks? Everything that's going on, implications to China, implications to Iran, those tend to be these knife-down scenarios that are your first gut reaction in the market.
What do the derivative space say about the chosen seven? Let's pick on Apple here. We've got JP Morgan coming out here on Friday, but I'm fascinated what the derivative dynamics are of massive free cash flow, massive cash on the balance sheet techs.
They're pretty sanguine, and that's been the thing, Tom.
Why?
That, it's just, you've seen...
She doesn't care about the why. She just looks at the math. That's all there is to it.
I can tell you the math is telling you it's sanguine. Now, the why, I think, because, one thing clients have said to me is, look, we talk about them as long duration instruments, but they don't have to be, right? They can choose to buy back stock if they want. They could choose to change that cash flow. So it's not necessarily the same as an XLU where they are just more duration sensitive. There is this ability to change that in mega cap tech, which gives them slightly more optionality. And then, of course, you've had the safe haven status that's lasted the last few years. And as you continue to see that, that continues to be reflected in option sentiment.
Where is positioning when it comes to energy, especially in light of some of the rally that we're seeing today and some of the discussions around some sort of continued price spike in the wake of potential sanctions and other types of production potential disruptions?
Yeah, so what I'll tell you is a lot of those hedges that you've seen have rolled off, but that was prior to this weekend. What I think we start seeing beginning today is reinitiation. So folks are going to sit here and they're going to say, okay, what are the geopolitics coming forward? Of course for energy, but obviously for the rates spectrum as well. And I think you're going to see reinitiation of a lot of hedges, which keeps that volatility bid.
Amy, thank you. Amy Wu-Silverman there of RBC Capital Markets. Your latest update this morning, this coming from AFP, quoting the Israeli Defense Minister ordering a complete siege on the Gaza Strip, saying this is a quote, Tom, "We're putting a complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed." That quote, according to AFP, coming from the Israeli Defense Minister.
So, and again, some would say it's been all closed for decades and decades, but the answer is the geography here is extraordinary. On the narrow strip, again, 2 times the size of Washington, D.C., all the way down to the Egyptian border. I'm fascinated what the Egyptian response will be. But the geography speaks volumes here, John, and I can't, I'm going to listen to Mark Kimmett, Ben Hodges, Stavridis of the United States Navy, those kind of people I'm going to listen to.
There's a couple of things we're listening for, Tom, whether Iran is directly implicated and whether this leads to a full grand invasion of Gaza. There was a strong hint it might when we heard over the weekend from Israel's ambassador to the UN that every inch of Gaza has become part of Hamas's war machine, Lisa vowing that his country, Israel, would obliterate all of the group's terror infrastructure. Based on the people we've already spoken to this morning, that is severely complicated by the scores of hostages that Hamas took over the weekend.
Some reports saying they number more than 150, and they are international hostages. I believe that Israel confirmed this morning that some of them are U.S. citizens. There is a question of how that complicates broad attacks, but it seems to not have precluded some sort of broad severing of a lot of the basic resources to the region. And, we are dealing with a situation where I believe it's 2.3 million people live there, and trying to weed out the Hamas versus the civilians is going to be very tough.
Tremendously difficult. That's the latest from the Israeli Defense Minister, according to AFP. Coming up in the next hour, plenty of guests lined up to discuss this throughout the morning on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Ron Dermer, the Minister of Strategic Affairs for Israel, will be joining us at 8:15 Eastern Time. Later on this hour, on the oil market, on Saudi Arabia, Ellen Wald-Tom, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council and author of Saudi Inc.
And yeah, exactly. Author of the royal family of Saudi and how they will respond to this, not only with Israel, but with the United States.
Tom, that's the latest. Much more still ahead. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning to you all. Your equity market is lower. Your oil market is rallying. 85.70. Crude up by 3.5%. Live from New York City, here's your equity market on the S&P 500, negative, pulling back down by 0.6%, following a decent week of gains on the S&P. Best week of gains going back to early September on the Nasdaq. Second week of gains, the Nasdaq last week at 1.75%. Down this morning, but up last week, even with a major move in the bond market. 2-year, 10-year, 30-year German Bund looks like this. Yields this morning just a little bit lower by a single basis point on a 10-year in Germany, 2.87. The Treasury market is closed after a week where we saw the 10-year climb by more than 20 basis points last week for a fifth straight weekly gain. The 30-year yield higher by more than 26 basis points. Tom, on a 30-year in America last week.
I'd say the zeitgeist over the weekend, and we'll pick it up tomorrow with a lot of data. I'd really pick it up in Asia tonight. Is the idea of, there's a lot of debt out there. Ed Yardeni was very, very good about that, just saying there's just way too much debt. And that's an overlay that I'm guilty of not talking enough about because we're so worried on surveillance about, hey, I slept, what happened overnight? That seems to be the theme, but there's just a ton of debt out there.
Waking up this morning,
very scientific.
What do you see? Thanks for that, Tom.
Thank you, I nailed it.
Dollar stronger, euro weaker. The euro against the dollar looking like this. We're negative by 0.5%, 105.37. Under surveillance this morning, the death toll from the conflict between Israel and the militant group Hamas topping 1,100, with fighting continuing into a third day. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iran helped plot the attack on Israel, Iran denying the report, while US Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN they haven't seen any evidence of Tehran's involvement. There's a big focus on the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. this morning. We have no speaker in the House. We have no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon. The latest on that front, Lisa, you noticed this one from Punchbowl News. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee will soon notify members that Jack Lew's confirmation hearing to be U.S. ambassador to Israel will be scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th.
There is a feeling that things are accelerating right now as people try to set up for something that could become a prolonged and protracted conflict. This is something the Israeli government's been saying, that they also are expecting something that is going to take a long time, also shutting down a natural gas production plant operated by Chevron as they try to protect their population in Israel. So it does feel like this is a multi-front war, and it is happening in a sense that people are going to be experiencing it for quite a while.
Things were quiet, so we were told.
Right.
The National Security Advisor to the President, Jake Sullivan, only a week ago, hasn't been this quiet in decades. Tom, it's not quiet anymore. And now there's a sense of urgency that you get in Washington that wasn't there before.
It's a new sense of urgency as you staff up. I'm so glad you brought up Jack Lew. Has been a wonderful friend of the show for years. Jack, if Jack Lew can't get bipartisan support, John, we just basically ought to give it up. He's a Democrat out of Massachusetts. He'd take offense that I said that. He's out of the Kennedy-Joe Moakley combine. But this is a guy who has massive bipartisan cred. And, John, to me, it's literally a litmus test of a dysfunctional Washington.
You'd have to imagine he will
through.
Get that confirmation after the events of the weekend. I want to get to the business reaction to some of this. A growing number of airlines suspending flights to Israel, with Delta, United, American, all cancelling flights to Tel Aviv. Lisa, as did some European airlines too. US authorities advising carriers to monitor the situation before resuming operations.
Yeah, I believe Lufthansa was also one of those canceling them. Not canceling was El Al and a host of others, as a number of Israeli-born people living in other places were coming back to be conscripted into the army, as they called up, 300,000?
300,000 according to the IDF.
300,000 troops. Yeah, that's this morning. They're saying they want that kind of force to be prepared to have some sort of offensive in the days to come.
The airlines might have to deal with higher energy prices as well. Crude rising this morning as the conflict in Israel could affect the wider Middle East, home to almost a third of global oil supply. Crude coming off its biggest weekly loss since March, but retracing some of those losses since the conflict began. We touched on this going into the weekend. Lisa, the headline of the Wall Street Journal, the front page, was about whether the Saudis would increase oil output into next year off the back of a potential pact between them and Israel. And now we are waking up this Monday morning basically suggesting that is on ice for now and maybe a long time.
And some analysts suggesting it's not unrelated, right? That this might have been one of the motivations for the attack, because geopolitically there were some regions, in particular Iran, that did not want to see this agreement come to the fore, which raises the question longer term about what kind of retaliatory actions there will be, not only against Iran, but with respect to sanctions by the U.S. on Iran, which is part of the reason why Halima Croft of RBC, you were mentioning her report over the weekend, talking about how that could be one of the initial potential reasons for a pop in energy prices.
Well, AMH suggested, in the last 20 minutes or so, part of that potential pact, Tom, was Saudi Arabia demanding concessions from Israel for the Palestinian people. Based on the events over the weekend, most people would suggest that's incredibly unlikely now.
The violence of the military right now of both sides is so great. I think the diplomacy is off. John, we need to do what Dr. Bremer was talking about this weekend. You mentioned 300,000 being called up in Israel. My mathiness on that is something below 10 million in the United States. I mean, we don't have scope and scale here. That's part of what we have to do here over the coming days as well. Right now, on the bond market, I guess, or on price down or what it's done, shattered your retirement account, Gennady Goldberg joins us, head of U.S. rate strategy at TD Securities. And he goes to a comment of Ed Yardeni of the Bond Vigilantes over the weekend, and that is, there is way too much debt. Cut to the chase. You guys nailed the curve inversion. TD Securities led on that. Is this the issue now? There's just too much debt?
Well, I think it's certainly become the issue. I mean, you're talking about higher oil prices. You've got other things, including much better than expected growth momentum over the last couple of years, a couple of months. And this debt issue is not going to go away, as you said. I mean, this is the overarching theme that we've been kind of talking about. Right. But no one's been paying attention to it for the last 15, 20 years.
I've been guilty of this.
I've been guilty as well.
Maya McGinnis was on this, the late Pete Peterson and the whole crew, but we're finally, okay, we're here. So how do our listeners and viewers adjust?
I think get ready for a test of higher interest rates. I mean, certainly the events in Israel are going to throw a little bit of a wrench into what we've been seeing for the last couple of weeks, and we'll see how this evolves, and hopefully the conflict certainly does die down rather than escalate. But if it continues to escalate, I mean, the big issue is you may actually see, certainly an increase in rates that could prove destabilizing for markets overall. I mean, we've been talking about a test of 5%. I think that's not out of the question yet.
Not far away right now.
No, not at all. And I think we can test a little bit higher. I mean, you look at how high we got just before the financial crisis, it's about 5.3% in tens. I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see us at least try to get through that level now.
Let's go through things with some purpose. So Steve Major of HSBC alluded to this, that typically supply doesn't matter in downturns. Supply matters in expansions. And he's basically suggesting, why would anyone want to take on additional duration for less yield in an expansion with the kind of data that we saw on Friday? The answer to that, based on the moves on Friday, is not many people want to do that, so yields up across the curve. I think the stress test we got this morning, and to some degree it's unfortunate the Treasury market is closed, is whether, when bad things happen, will we still buy Treasuries? Are we learning this morning that we will?
I think we will. I mean, certainly the Treasury market, I mean, you see the reaction in the dollar as well. It's still the risk-off asset. So it's not like that's going away anytime soon. But on a broader scale, I mean, if you're an asset manager, yes, you might be allocating a little bit more into U.S. Treasuries at this point because it's risk-off. On a bigger picture, you're still seeing strong growth, and you're seeing a lot of supply. And, should you be allocating, and should you be trying to catch that falling knife effectively, before you're certain about where this conflict goes next?
We're dealing with the potential for the U.S. to increase aid to both Ukraine and now to Israel at a time where there already are constrained finances. And I'm wondering how much that's going to increase the appetite to borrow more, even though rates are high and there is this concern about the deficit. How does that factor into your view of rates going higher?
I mean, it just biases us to the upside on the rate side. And that's why I think a test of 5%, maybe a little bit higher, is certainly possible in the short term. The big question for me is, what does that do to the economy as a whole? Right? The government will certainly continue to borrow, and I don't think it's an issue. It's more of a, what price can you borrow at, rather than whether you can borrow an extra 50 or 100 billion. The big question for us is, what does that do to companies that also need to borrow in this market?
The sort of common thought recently has been that companies have adapted and adjusted, to Tom's point. And what you've seen is either workouts with private credit, private debt funds, or else basically they've extended and pushed out their maturities so long that they are immune. When is that no longer the case? When do you start to see a potential for a risk that has not yet been priced in?
I think with every passing day that we've got higher interest rates, it continues to build. And the question I hear from companies, and I meet with quite a few of them on a weekly basis, is when are 10-year yields going back below 4%, right? That's the big question on everyone's minds, which tells me even though they may be immune, they may be immunized or whatnot, they're still really waiting for rates to go down because they've got financing needs and they're waiting, right? So when can they no longer wait? Is that early next year? Is it kind of in the middle of next year? The big question is when does that when do you get enough of that tick going where they're just forced to step in and borrow?
John, I failed. We've been doing so much reading in on this terrible war in Israel and the Gaza Strip. The bank rate 30-year on Friday, I missed it, 7.93%. That's a jump from 0.88 up to 0.93. That's untenable.
Who's paying it?
Somebody's out there that is forced to pay it. There's somebody out there selling into this, and that yield up is priced down. I mean, these are the knock-on effects here. What is agency paper? What does credit look like?
Cheap. And the issue is...
Well, that's called price down.
Right.
That's pro-talk for price down.
Right, exactly. Cheap. The problem is what makes it richen, right? What's the catalyst? Is it a weakening in the economic data? And we haven't really seen it yet. It hasn't actually happened as quickly as economists have forecasted, and certainly guilty of that as well. But if the data weakens, certainly the buyers will step in. But the buyers right now are waiting on the sidelines saying, why would we catch this particular knife?
Barclays made the point going into the weekend last week that if the equity market crashes, then the buyers will come back into the treasury market. But Friday was an odd one because bonds went down, yields surged in a fairly intuitive way following a blowout payrolls report, and then equities rallied.
Right.
What did you make of that, just sitting at a bond desk?
Sitting there just scratching my head, to be entirely honest. I mean, I think there was a lot of repositioning on Friday. You even saw the reaction in yields as well. Yields went sharply higher, then retraced a very large chunk of their move.
Was that something technical?
I think there was a lot of short covering at that point. I think that was people taking off a lot of their short fixed income positions, maybe a little bit cleaner, so we'll see how it goes into next week. We've got a lot of event risk, between the FOMC speakers and the CPI report. I think people were taking some chips off the table.
We have not even, folks, this is how crazy this morning is with the horror that we're seeing in this war. John, I don't believe we've mentioned there's some inflation data later this week.
Yeah, Thursday, I believe. PPI data as well.
Which is arguably more important than this stunning jobs report we saw on Friday.
Several months ago, we were talking about the potential for the whole curve to drop to 3. 2's out to 30s, and now we're having a conversation about the whole curve coming up to 5 just a couple of months later. That is a major change. If you're just joining us, welcome to the program. Your S&P 500 is negative here. We're down by 0.6%. Kennedy, looking ahead to CPI, what are you and the team looking for later this week?
We're looking for a little deceleration overall. I mean, if you're looking at year-ago rates, they will continue to slow. The big question over the next couple of months has to be oil. That's really the big unknown in our minds. I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of the Fed, they're still looking at a lot of the core components actually slowing down. So that's good news for them. The big question for them is going to be, what does headline inflation do? And what's that pass-through from some of the oil pressures into core inflation as well? We know that's not zero.
Did we start to hit demand resistance with gasoline prices in the last week? Do you trust that data?
That's a little bit of a tough one. Americans are still going to drive. And it's a question of what is really the breaking point for, how high do prices actually have to go for folks to actually really start to cut? I can tell you, I was out on the road this weekend. It didn't feel like anyone was stopping driving, at least from these higher gas prices.
You hitting the traffic?
Oh, yeah.
Traffic in Manhattan, just brutal over the last...
Every year it gets worse.
I know.
Every year.
I know. Kennedy, thank you. Thank you, sir. Kennedy Goldberg there of TD Securities. Coming up next, Ellen Wald at the Atlantic Council joining us after the tragic, horrific events over the weekend. And the horror, Lisa, it continues based on some of the brutal imagery that we're seeing over the last few days.
I really am curious to hear from Ellen Wald, given her Saudi Inc. Book and her studies in this region, to understand what the response is and what the potential for an ongoing deal could be at a time of such conflict.
Brent crude just north of 87.30 on Brent. On WTI, higher by 3.3% to 85.50. Ellen Wald of the Atlantic Council up next.
I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks.
The President of the United States over the weekend following the tragic events in Israel, the attacks that have led to a war breaking out between Israel and Hamas, that conflict entering day 3, the death toll topping 1,100. From New York this morning, good morning to you. Your equity market on the S&P 500 pulling back by 0.7%. Bonds are rallying. Over in Germany, yields are lower by a couple of basis points. The Treasury market is closed today. Your 10-year German 10-year yield is 2.86. In the commodity market, a sell-off last week. The biggest weekly loss for crude going back to March. Crude pulling back by several percentage points, Tom, last week. 85.50 is where we are now on WTI, a bounce of 3% on both WTI crude and Brent.
The key global barometer, and again, John, this goes through the safety and ability to transmit not only the Persian Gulf, but also the Suez Canal. And that gets you over to the challenges of anyone at war in that region, and particularly Israel at war in that region, really going back to 1973. We forget in 73 that Israeli forces got within X miles of Damascus to the north, and they made it to the Suez Canal and over the Suez Canal in 73. That's a bit of history that I think people really are wide on. This all comes up to the geopolitics of the region. Expert on this and a good friend of Bloomberg's surveillance is Ellen Wald, senior fellow at Atlantic Council. Her book, Saudi Inc., is definitive on hydrocarbons. Ellen, thank you so much for joining this morning. Really timely to have you with us. How does Israel get its oil? Are they in some way oil independent?
They're not really oil independent. Israel actually does, or used to get, quite a bit of oil from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It was shipped out via the Ceyhan pipeline from the port of Ceyhan in Turkey to ports in Israel, to Haifa, and to other ports. I don't think Israel's particularly concerned about getting oil or making sure that they have enough oil at this point, though one interesting point that has just come up is that Israel asked Chevron to shut down the operation of the Tamar gas field platform, which is out in the Mediterranean in the northern part of Israel. And to me, that says that either they think that there could potentially be some sort of terrorist attack on that platform, which potentially either from Iran or Hezbollah, which I would say definitely signals to me a widening of this highly regional conflict, and something that actually could be a potential threat to oil markets, to gas markets, especially if you consider that, like you said, the Suez Canal is not all that far.
To take it to Saudi Arabia and your expertise there, which part of Palestine does Saudi Arabia, does the royal family support?
That's a great question. And they're definitely much more interested in the Palestinian Authority run parts, the West Bank, than they are with Hamas. Hamas and Saudi Arabia, they see Hamas as a very destabilizing element, especially the Saudi monarchy does not like terrorists. Terrorists are just as much a threat to them and to their stability as they are to other areas. So and what's interesting is that they keep pushing for this regional two-state solution, regional peace agreement. They have always said that their recognition of Israel depends upon a regional peace deal and two-state solution, which is one of the reasons why I think it hasn't really gone very far and we haven't seen very much, because that's not something that Israel or that the U.S. is really prepared to push for at this point. The question is, will they drop this in favor of getting a defense pact from Washington, as they've indicated? They haven't quite indicated that, but they definitely have indicated that that's a top priority for them, especially on the nuclear front. And so that says to me that maybe they're willing to negotiate a bit on that requirement.
Ellen, there was also talk going into the weekend that as part of this pact, the likelihood is that we would get crude output increased into next year. And as you look across the region now, where will Saudi Arabia stand on that particular point? And what could this mean for Iran production and those barrels of oil that find their way on international markets?
Exactly. And Iran has been selling more oil recently, not necessarily because they're evading sanctions anymore, because sanctions are not as tight as they were, but simply because Iran has been able to increase their production. And so they're selling more with prices up across the markets. Iran is able to get more money for its oil, even if it's still selling it at a discount, and even though it's got competition from Russian oil. So if Saudi Arabia puts out another 1 million barrels a day than they are right now, that would definitely threaten Iran's money-making scheme from oil, because it would send prices lower. Of course, there are lots of other things that could also send prices lower for Iran. So that's not the only issue here. I think it's compelling that Saudi Arabia sees that 1 million barrels a day as a bargaining chip with the United States. They're saying, hey, you're going into an election year that could be tough. We can put 1 million barrels a day back on the market and lower oil prices for you if you help us out, if you get us this defense pact before election season, before a new administration comes in and we have to start all over. So I think that's a very compelling chip that Saudi Arabia has thrown into the game here.
You talked about Iran selling more oil, and it comes at a time where there's talk of the potential for sanctions or additional punitive measures if Iran is deemed to have a more active role in the planning and the execution of this attack. From your vantage point, how realistic is that? What kind of influence could that have, not only on the price of crude, but just in general to the region and the geopolitics there?
That's a really good point. I think that any kind of tightening of sanctions is not really going to have much of an impact. It's purely, something that it's purely just hyperbole and rhetoric, because enforcing sanctions is a multi-year-long process. Now, if we were hearing talk of, say, a blockade against Iranian ships leaving the Persian Gulf, that would be a totally different story. So if the United States is willing to take its Navy and ensure that Iranian ships can't get out of the Persian Gulf to sell their oil, or that ships that have transferred Iranian oil to them and not maybe Iranian ships can't get out, that would be a huge shift away from the current policy, which is just let's try to enforce sanctions. It takes 3, 4, 5 years to do that, and that could definitely cause a major spreading of the geopolitical conflict. I would say if that happens, oil prices would go through the roof.
But Ellen, can you just say on a broader level then, do you think that any kind of interruption or disruption to oil production has been overstated, and particularly in the price of oil this morning? Or do you think that there is a broader implication as this goes on that you are watching?
I think that the $4 increase that we saw overnight was too much. We've had regional conflict between Israel and Gaza before, and oil prices jump a little and then they come back down because people realize there is no larger impact to oil producers. But in this case, we are really, I think, on the verge of a larger geopolitical regional conflict. There are so many other pieces here that it isn't that the jump in oil prices is basically anticipating that. It's anticipating that there could be some kind of disruption, and that's more likely in this case than it has been in the past.
We need to diagnose the sell-off as well last week too, Ellen. If we can finish there, I think it's important. Was that sell-off in anticipation of potential boost to crude output from Saudi, or was it because we saw evidence of our demand limits being tested by this price surge?
I think it's the second. It's definitely more of a larger demand issue that is coming to light, or that is finally being realized in the market. I do think that the news that Saudi Arabia could increase production starting in 2024, if this, if they get what they want from Washington, could definitely be a catalyst. But that really didn't come out until Friday, and the sell-off had started before that. So I do think it's much more based on the demand issue.
That news was dated pretty quickly, let's put it that way. And thank you, Anna Wald of the Atlantic Council, on the latest. I've said this a few times, Tom. Front page of the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. Crude output, Saudi Arabia could be boosted off the back of an Israel pact with
changed.
Saudi, and everything's changed very quickly.
We heard it. We've each got our own story on this. And I would go back to 73 and 67 as a child, how I interpreted that. But I think it took me a couple hours to get to that emotion of, is the headline was, it's their 9/11. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I didn't get there right away. Neither did the Wall Street Journal or any other news organizations. This is the shock here was stunning.
$88 on Brent, very close to that level. On WTI, just through 86, running here by more than 4%. Coming up in the next hour, Ron Dermott, the Minister of Strategic Affairs for Israel. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
We chose the peaceful path to achieve our rights, but Israel continued using blunt force against Palestinian lives and Palestinian rights.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowicz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowicz, and Tom Keene on radio and television, on economics, finance, investment, on international relation, and this morning on war. John Ian Bremmer sums it up beautifully out on Twitter. This in the last 40 minutes. This from Dr. Bremmer, the Israeli defense minister. I ordered a full siege on the Gaza Strip. No power, no food, no gas. Everything is closed. That upon 2 million people.
As they call up 300,000 people in Israel, according to the IDF, Tom, we're focused on two things: the potential for escalation abroad and the dysfunction at home. On the escalation abroad, the potential that Iran will be directly implicated by Israel and what that could mean for the potential of a broader regional conflict, and the dysfunction at home. We have no speaker in the House, no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon. Whether this will give Washington a sense of urgency to address some of these issues.
No, to everyone, and particularly to the United States, with Anne-Marie Horton joining us here in a moment. John, it's about the idea of, well, these are normal times and we can have our domestic games, but the domestic games slip away given a legitimate war. There's no other way to put it.
Almost immediately, based on the reporting we've had from Punchbowl News this morning, Tom, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will soon notify members that Jack Lew's confirmation hearing to be U.S. ambassador to Israel will be scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th. So already you can see there's some action in Washington where there wasn't any at all in the last couple of months.
The former Secretary of Treasury there. Lisa, I love what you've done in your reading over the weekend about how this could expand beyond a strip of land between Egypt and Israel. Egypt used to be the protectorate of Gaza Strip until '67, I believe it was. And then it can move to the West Bank, off to the northeast, or it can move north up the Mediterranean to Lebanon.
There was some discussion about fortifying the area with Syria, but also with Lebanon, especially in light of Hezbollah. But here's the issue, right, is that right now this is really entering a fragile time for the Middle East. It comes at the time where we had been talking about a Saudi Arabian deal normalizing relations with Israel. This is not necessarily unrelated. And now there are questions of what does that do to that? How is Iran involved? And what role does the likes of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, like Anne-Marie actually just pointing out, have in trying to negotiate some sort of peace deal or hostage release type of agreement that could move this forward in a more benign way than what we see unfolding?
I question where that stands now after some of the images we're seeing and some of the counts. I look, Lisa, to your good thoughts here about some form of dialogue, but you just wonder of the violence to come before there is dialogue.
In conversations we've had so far, there are a lot of questions around where the intelligence breaches happen, not only in Israel, but also in the U.S., what the response will be like and how far this will percolate, which is the reason why there's nervousness. You could feel that this morning, Tom, in the tape.
The bond market closed today. I believe it's Columbus Day, or at least that's what we used to call it, something like that, John. You know, there's like 4 names for the holiday. But the bond market closed today. But, John, there is a bond proxy. I mentioned Swiss franc, and you mentioned German yields coming in.
German yields coming in. It's classic risk aversion, textbook stuff. Equity markets lower by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Bond market bid, slight rally. Yields lower by a single basis point. Wouldn't make too much of that. Dollar stronger in the places you expect the dollar to be stronger in. a little bit of a weaker euro, stronger Japanese yen. But looking at crude, there's the move, up by 4% following the biggest weekly sell-off going back to March. WTI, Tom, 86, Brent crude just short of 88.
To all of you on radio and television, we've been trying to give you good conversation on this war. We had a gentleman with decades of CIA experience with us in a previous hour, and I'm thrilled to tell you that we'll have the former ambassador of Israel to the United States coming up here in a number of minutes. Anne-Marie Horton joins us now, our Bloomberg Washington correspondent. I still can't get used to the modern silliness that we don't have an ambassador to Israel. I get it, days and weeks after an inauguration. Well, this is juvenile.
Well, that nomination was announced from President Biden in September. They have yet to have a hearing yet. There's a number of steps that go into a nomination. But historically, if you look at how long, say, it took the Reagan administration versus the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the average to get things done in the Senate has grown exponentially larger.
I want all of our listeners and viewers are saying, AMH, why?
There's a number of issues. Sometimes it comes down to specifics on the individual. When you look at someone like Jack Lew, he has not yet gone through the Senate Foreign Relations confirmation hearing. That is the first step after they go through the FBI and the IRS investigation. An issue that can happen next, and there's some Republicans that have voiced concerns about an individual like Jack Lew because he worked in the Obama administration, and the Obama administration, of course, had the JCPOA with Iran. If there's any sort of lingering or confusion or concern that a Jack Lew ambassador may want to see better relationship with Iran, and it's not going to be tougher on Iran, one single senator can have a hold. We're not there yet when it comes to Jack Lew, and Punchbowl is reporting that the hearing will happen October 18th. That is 2 days after the Senate actually comes back. So they are moving quickly on this, and he was only nominated in September. There's other issues, though. We've had people in limbo for months.
November 17th, we have a deadline. Government shutdown. Can you imagine a government shutdown with this happening abroad?
I can, only because at the moment we still don't even have a Speaker of the House. And there's not a lot of legislative days left in the calendar to get all of this done. And what you hear from interim Speaker Patrick McHenry is that the only thing he can do right now is bring a floor vote on a Speaker of the House. There's not much legislation that can get done. Potentially, what you're seeing happen internationally will provide a little bit more of an impetus for Republicans to act. House Republicans will be back in Washington, D.C., along with me this evening, 6 p.m., and they're going to have a dialogue and a discussion, as well as they will have tomorrow. And then Wednesday, they're supposed to have a vote within their conference. Can they rally behind these two individuals, potentially Jim Jordan, chair of the House Judiciary Committee? This is someone who's a staunch Trump ally. Trump is backing him. Or Steve Scalise, which is number 2 to McCarthy, potentially also McCarthy foe in some senses. There's a lot of reporting that McCarthy aides have been calling to whip for Jordan, but Scalise would be the obvious individual because he is number 2, but he's also dealing with some health concerns. But yet we're not sure just yet who can get to 217.
AMH, thank you. The latest from Anne-Marie. Tom, a real sense of urgency now in Washington to get a move on.
Well said, John. I think there's a sense of urgency, but I'm really not quite sure if the officials want to do that. Right now, joining us, Marta Norton, Chief Investment Officer at Morningstar Wealth, as you consider 2023 and what your 201k has done. Marta, Morningstar owns a high ground on the analysis of active versus index funds. Let me start with an update on how active management has done coming out of the pandemic.
You know, it's kind of an interesting story because when we look back on active and passive and the narratives around them, it's been this view that passive is ascendant and active is on its way out. And I think what's been really interesting that we've seen in the wake of the pandemic is that there's been more opportunities for active to add value. Now, I'm not saying that's been the case for all active managers, but this sense that a rising tide has lifted all ships and all you need to do is own your S&P 500 and your treasury bonds and you can call things a day. I think that view has at least been called into question to some degree. Now, we have our own investment strategies within Morningstar Wealth, and what we've seen is actually a real improvement of our performance over this period, and a lot of that has been because we haven't been in those traditional kind of big treasury stakes, big S&P 500 exposures.
There's a real test here, and this is something that we've been talking about, John raised earlier, about how bonds will factor into portfolios at a time of instability, especially given that this weekend we saw that bonds were the source of such instability. How much will they act as a haven in this next cycle, whatever it may be, however the conflict that we saw really spring up over the weekend escalates?
You know, it's a really important question, and I think one of the things that comes to mind for me as we have taken a look at this tremendous shift in bond yields over this period is that there's been a lot of introspection. Can we expect the treasuries to behave as that safe haven status like they have in the past, especially at the long end? And I think what we would expect as we take a look at real geopolitical risk is that some of that introspection dies out in the near term, and there is kind of a shift to some of these areas. We see that with the dollar, of course, but then also when the Treasury market opens, we could see some folks hiding for the protection there, even though there are these existential questions around debt levels, around deficits, and of course around higher for longer from the positioning of the Fed.
You own the high ground on flows. What are the flows in fixed income? I'm not talking about fancy surveillance talk about spread market duration and convexity. I'm talking about retirees scared stiff. What do you see in Chicago?
Well, I can tell you that from a flow perspective, we've actually seen still some dependence on long treasuries, more so than you would expect given performance. But what I will tell you from anecdotal conversations with financial advisors is there's enormous frustration and enormous disappointment. So I don't know if people have found that new linchpin for their portfolios, and maybe that's what flows are telling us. But I think psychologically, there certainly has been a bit of a pullback from what they can kind of depend on from the Treasury side of things.
Marta, thank you for your view this morning. Difficult morning to talk about markets, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Marta Norden there of Morningstar Wealth. If you are just joining us, equities are pulling back but slowly recovering. We're down about 0.5% on the S&P 500. In the commodity market, the rally picks up in crude. Tom higher by more than 4% on WTI to 86, very close to 88 on Brent this morning.
And news driven here, and we're going to have to see. I just continue to follow singular headlines. What I'm going to say late afternoon to Israel, and you go into the night and you wonder what military response we're going to see from both sides here, and then how that affects oil going into the next morning.
Classic risk aversion. Equities lower. If you are just joining us, we're down here by 0.5%. Coming up very shortly, Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, a conversation you do not want to miss. Tom, that conversation in about 5 minutes' time.
Former ambassador of Israel to the United States. This guy is the guy wired into the United States and Washington for Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He is the guest this morning.
Especially someone who has insight into the agreement that was getting negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Israel and where that stands. There is a real question here about what happens now, where the pressures are, how isolated Iran is from the likes of Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, as they try to negotiate some sort of peace.
And just hearing this from the New York Stock Exchange, a moment of silence at 9:20 Eastern Time, a moment of silence that we will observe on Bloomberg TV and Radio. The New York Stock Exchange extends its deepest sympathies to those killed and affected by the ongoing violence in Israel and Gaza. In remembrance of the lives lost and those still being impacted, we will hold a moment of silence at 9:20 Eastern Time. That's about an hour and 5 minutes away. Let's go through the broader price action at the moment. Equities pulling back. Bonds are rallying, yields are lower. In Germany, Treasury markets closed. Dollar stronger in the places you'd expect the dollar to be stronger. Against the euro, the euro's back to 105.28. Against the yen showing a little bit of strength, so a bit of a haven trade there, still in the mix for the Japanese yen. And in the commodity market, there's your rally, up by 4%. Seemingly this comes back to Iran every single time, Lisa. Are they going to be directly implicated? Does this have the potential for a broader regional conflict? Does it take away the incentive to close that deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and ultimately take away the potential that we get a boost to output anytime soon?
Although Ellen Wald, just earlier, who wrote the book on Saudi Arabia, said that she doesn't really see any kind of sanctions materially impacting the amount of oil that Iran is putting out onto the market. So there are real questions here about where some of the disruptions will come.
Coming up next, Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs.
The challenge for Israel and the challenge for all who support Israel and oppose horrific acts of terrorism is, again, to take measures that provide for accountability for what's happened, and also to do our best to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And that is likely to take some time, and it's fraught with very difficult decisions for the Israelis to make.
We need to talk about those difficult decisions, Tom. That was Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, speaking on ABC.
Welcome all of you to Bloomberg Surveillance this morning, and this is an important conversation. Why? The duration. Ron Dermer is Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, but far more, he was Ambassador of Israel to the United States for 7 years. His extended period in Washington, his work at Wharton, among others, is noted. And to have Ambassador Dermer with us, John, with his experience across all of a decade is important.
Minister, thank you for being with us this morning. And I think first and foremost, we have to extend our deepest sympathies to you and the people of Israel. Our first thoughts go to the hostages, the scores of hostages that were taken over the weekend. And as you know, there are some reports at the moment in the media that we'd love to get an on-the-record response from you on. This from Reuters a little bit early this morning, that Qatari mediators have held talks with Hamas officials to try to negotiate the release of Israeli women and children held in Gaza. Minister, are there active talks led by Qatar to release hostages?
Well, what I guess you just read to me is that Qataris were talking to Hamas about it. Israel's not been negotiating with anybody.
Has Qatar spoken to you about the release of hostages and their role they might play as a mediator?
As I said, what the Qataris speaking to Hamas and talking about different things. Look, people are outraged by what happened. I'm sure you're outraged. I appreciate the condolences. I know they're heartfelt and they're deeply appreciated. We haven't seen something like this, even in the Middle East, which, as you know, has a lot of brutality and savagery in it. We haven't seen savagery like this since ISIS. When you have killers, scores of hundreds, really, of terrorists who invaded Israel on Saturday morning in trucks with AK-47s and just mowed down people who were at a dance festival, went into people's homes, killed whole families, kidnapped children, women, elderly. This thing is sick and it's savage. And you really have a battle between the forces of civilization on the one side and the forces of barbarism. And civilization is going to have to win. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the days ahead. And as you heard from Secretary Blinken, it may take some time, but we're going to exact such a high price that not only will Hamas never consider doing this again, I think none of Israel's enemies are going to ever think about doing something like this again. You know, the feeling of euphoria on the other side, Israelis, those of a certain age, remember 1973, when a surprise attack was launched against us on 2 different fronts. There was euphoria then for a few days, but then Israel turned the tide. And the end of the war looked very different than the beginning of the war, and this is exactly what's going to happen now.
Minister, based on what you've just told us, can we just assume then that a full ground invasion is inevitable?
We're going to do whatever we have to do to send a lesson that they're going to understand for many, many decades. Not just Hamas, not just the other terror organizations in Gaza, but all the terror organizations and all the enemies of Israel. And Iran is the biggest enemy of all. And they're pulling the strings behind the scenes, giving money, giving weapons, having meetings to try to coordinate attacks in Israel. And as I speak to you, Iran is trying to push other people into the theater of war. We're going to have to send a message to everybody, because Israel, you know, as you know, we're a tiny country. We're about the size of New Jersey. America's about 40 times the population that we have, which goes to show you how heinous the attack was yesterday. Because when you have maybe 1,000 people in Israel who were killed on a single day, and your population is 40 times the size, it's around 40,000 Americans. That's more than 10 9/11. So you can imagine the sense of disgust that we have. We have to send a message to all of Israel's enemies, because we're a strong country, but we're tiny, and we can go from strength to vulnerability. I think people are going to see the strength of Israel, the might of Israel, and I hope that the wall-to-wall support that we appreciate, that we have today from President Biden, the support on both sides of the aisle in Washington, I hope in the days ahead that support continues when Israel has to do what it has to do in order to exact such a heavy price from this terror organization that not only do they not threaten us, that they don't threaten any civilized country around the world. Believe me, this will inspire terrorists the world over, just like you had the ISIS caliphate that started inspiring people all around the globe. The world came together and understood they have to crush that caliphate. We have a force like that right in our backyard, not thousands of miles away, but right in our backyard. a few meters over the borders, and we're going to have to crush both their capability and also their spirit. They will rue the day 2 days ago. We're going to remember that day. Israel will always remember that day, but all the terror organizations around us are going to remember this period for a very long time and the critical miscalculation that Hamas made, thinking that it was going to be business as usual in Israel. Believe me, it is not. The people are outraged, and they have awoken not a sleeping giant, but a sleeping Maccabee. And they're going to see it in the days and weeks ahead.
Minister, you mentioned Iran. Have you seen personally, or are you aware of, any evidence that Iran was directly responsible and helped coordinate these attacks over the weekend?
Well, let me tell you what we do know for sure. We know for sure that Iran provides the last numbers I saw, 93% of the military budget of Hamas is provided for by Iran. They are trying and have worked to put weapons, not just into Gaza, but also in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. They also support Hezbollah, as you know, on our northern border. We know that as a fact. We know that Iran has coordinated meetings with all of its terrorist proxies in the region, Hamas in Gaza and another terror organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and Hezbollah, almost a kind of joint operations. I don't want to say joint operations center, but coordinated meetings. There was one question that I'm sure you're interested in. Did they know about this beforehand? Initially, we didn't think that they did. Now there is some evidence that they might have known about it. We are working to verify that evidence. That's why maybe there's some conflicting reports in the press that we don't exactly know. But now that we're looking back and we're looking at all of our intel and seeing exactly what the situation is, it's still not clear to us, but they might have done it. But I have to tell you, they are working right now to bring more and more terror groups into this fight. So everyone has to know it, and it's important not just, I think, to stand unequivocally with Israel against Hamas, to call for freeing the hostages, but also to stand unequivocally against Iran. You know, there's going to be the UN Security Council can tomorrow, Europe, France, Britain, Germany, they can work to snap bang the UN sanctions, the Security Council sanctions against Iran. You have to enforce oil sanctions against Iran. They're exporting a lot of oil. They're getting a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars. It's time that the world unites against Iran, because what you're seeing today is a tentacle of an Iranian octopus. And we have to not only cut off the tentacle, we have to deal with the regime that is sending them. And I hope that the world will stand with Israel, as I said, in the days and weeks ahead, to reverse this and turn it into a victory against terrorism and barbarism.
Minister, we have some news to work through on our side, and I'd love to continue this conversation with you at the same time. According to the CBS White House reporter, at least 9 Americans were killed in Israel. As I'm sure you know, this goes beyond the people of Israel. The whole world is looking at this moment. Just on Iran, you mentioned that you may have some evidence that implicates Iran directly for the operations that took place over the weekend. Could you share with us the nature of that evidence?
Unfortunately, I can't. If I could, I would, but I can't, and we're going to have to look through it. Now our working assumption is that they may have. Our working assumption a couple of days ago was that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. And, you know, when we make an official statement, we'll make an official statement. But we have to work through that right now, because I want to make sure that when I say it, we know with 100% certainty. Now that is our working assumption.
We did hear this from the Wall Street Journal, that Iranian security officials helped plan Hamas's attacks and gave a green light for the assault at a meeting in Beirut last Monday, according to senior members of Hamas and Hezbollah. Are you aware of a meeting that took place in the last week between Iran and leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah?
They have meetings all the time. It's not secret. You can see pictures of them meeting with Iran leadership, the leadership of their Iranian Revolutionary Guard leadership, their Quds Force leadership, meeting with these other senior officials. So they've had many, many, many meetings over the last few months, and they work very hard. What is Iran trying to do? Those of you viewers who know the map of the Middle East know that Iran supports the Shia militias in Iraq. They're trying to establish a beachhead, a terrorist beachhead against Israel in Syria. They support Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the northern part of Israel. They support both Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza. Right. They support the Houthis in Yemen, and what they're trying to do is put a noose around Israel's neck with all of these terror groups there. And we have to make sure that we break out of that noose and deliver such a mighty blow that they're not going to forget it for generations.
Ambassador, I want to take your years of experience here, and it's outside your remit, but I'm sure it's something everyone wants to know. I can't get my head around how Israel invades the Gaza Strip. Do you anticipate substantial bombing and air attack, or are we ready for some definitive, original building-to-building urban warfare in Gaza?
Well, because I'm a member of the Security Cabinet, I'm not going to discuss that. Let's just say we have a clear goal to cripple the capabilities of Hamas and also their will to wage war against us. So you're going to have to interpret that the way you want. I have to leave it at that. But it's people who doubt Israel's capabilities are making a huge mistake. We will do what we have to do in order to achieve that goal. And we are going to have to achieve this goal, obviously, first and foremost for Israel, but it's for all of our Arab partners in the region. Believe me, put aside all of those statements that are made by foreign ministries in the region. And some of you may have conversations with officials from the Middle East, and they may tell you a very different story about Israel than they may be saying publicly. There have been times in the past where Israel has fought with these terror organizations, and the ones who are rooting for us, usually first and foremost, are these Arab states who are threatened by these jihadi forces. Whether it's a Shia jihadi force or a Shia group like Iran and its proxies, or a Sunni group like Hamas, they don't want these forces of barbarism to win because they threaten them.
Ambassador,
and this is very just one thing, if I may. This is also very important for the pursuit of peace eventually. Because no one is going to make peace with the weak. We have to be very strong, and it's strength that is actually going to improve our chances to reach an historic peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, which I have no doubt is one of the reasons why this action was taken at this time.
For our audience, Ambassador Dermer, can you triangulate the focus obviously on Gaza, but also now on the West Bank and a fractious northern border with Lebanon? How will Israel affect a three-front war?
Well, we have to ensure that our force structure is done in a certain way that we can deal with any threats that would materialize. And you say quite rightly, we have issues on the northern border. We had sirens there just about an hour ago. We had an attack there yesterday. There are different attempts for attacks. So we have to be clear on our northern border that we have all the capabilities we need to defend ourselves. As you know, the United States brought a carrier group into the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that sends a very strong message to deter our enemies, and it makes it clear that America backs Israel. And again, we're deeply appreciative of the Biden administration for doing that. I think it makes the chances of war less likely, not more likely. And of course, as you said, in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, we've had terror actions that have happened there, and we have an eye on that. We have to have our eye on a sort of a 360 radius in order to deal with all these different challenges. But I'll tell you, the chances of having a multi-front war grow when people see Israel as being vulnerable. So the stronger and faster we act, the more it will send a message of strength and purpose. And that message is critical to actually ultimately de-escalate the situation and prevent these things from happening for many, many decades. This is an attack, I want to say it again, the likes of which has never happened in the state of Israel. We may have lost 1,000 people in a single day.
Ambassador,
that has never happened in the state of Israel.
Ambassador, there's a big question around Saudi Arabia and the talks about normalizing relations. I know you've been involved with those, and it seems like those are at least iced in the near term. Saudi Arabia put out a statement saying that it repeated its warnings of the dangers of the explosion of the situation as a result of the continued occupation and deprivation of the Palestinian people of their legitimate rights. How much do you see this as really precluding additional discussions with Saudi Arabia and making this kind of normalization talk not viable in the near term?
Well, a lot of people were surprised by the Abraham Accords, a few years ago when no one thought that could possibly happen. But Israel proved itself, its strength, frankly, its security strength, its economic vitality. I think that's what made those accords ultimately possible. I think the critical question of whether we're going to be able to achieve this historic peace with Saudi Arabia that pushes the whole Arab-Israeli conflict into a completely different place and can lead to a broader reconciliation between Muslims and Jews as well. The critical factor will be how Israel emerges from this fight. Or do we emerge as a victor? Because people make peace with winners. People make peace with the strong. They do not make peace with the weak. And that will be the critical factor. I'm telling you, take all the statements, all the diplomatic statements that have been made, put them aside. It's not relevant. I think there are many Arab partners in this region that want a different future, that are thinking about what's going to happen in 20, 30, 40 years down the road when oil doesn't have the value to their countries that it has today. They need a partner in Israel that can help strengthen their own national security, that can help their own national prosperity. You saw a few weeks ago at the G20 when several countries, the United States, European countries, India, launched this vision of an economic corridor that would go from India through the Arabian Peninsula into Israel and towards Europe. I mean, that's a game changer, an economic game changer for the region. And I think the Saudis have great plans for building their country. And believe me, there are a lot of people in a lot of places in the Middle East, no matter what they say publicly, are rooting for Israel to win. And I think they're going to get exactly what they want.
Minister, just to wrap things up, because I know you have to go, one final question. Winning. How do you define victory in a moment like this one?
Like I said, you have to cripple their capability, and you have to crush their will to do such an action for decades and decades to come. Not just Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also other terror organizations in the region. We rely as a small country on our deterrence, but deterrence doesn't last forever. You have to exercise power and force to always make clear to your enemies that you're prepared to fight. Not only do you have the capability, but you have the will to fight. And our enemies, Hamas, obviously miscalculated here, because if they think that this action that they just took in murdering 1,000 Israelis and just shooting our civilians and taking scores of people hostage and having over maybe 3,000 people who are wounded, that this is going to be business as usual, they just have no idea who the people of Israel are. And I think they're going to find out in the days ahead.
Minister, we appreciate your time this morning at a very difficult time for your country, and hopefully we can catch up again soon. Ron Dermer there, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs. The conversation will continue on Bloomberg TV in the next hour. On the Open, Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen, Kristen Bidley of City, Henrietta Trey's, Tom, to kick off the show, of Vader Partners.
Great guest. It would be wonderful to talk to Henrietta Trey's, particularly about the openings that we've seen in Washington as well. And the markets, well, they've deteriorated ever so slightly is where I'm going to put it. The VIX 19.01, SPX down 27, Dow 165, NASDAQ down 0.8%. The bond market is closed today in the United States. We're seeing German yields come in to a lower yield, dollar stronger as you would expect, and I would note Swiss franc a little bit stronger as well. Lisa, Brent crude, I had an 88 print earlier, 87.75 on Brent crude.
The conversation that we just had there, again, do what we will do, just these hard words coming from Israel as they prepare to retaliate and as they prepare to send 300,000 troops that they have called up. It really raises questions about how this will evolve in the days to come, not only geopolitically, but also for markets.
Scheduled economics, finance, and investment, it slips by today, and particularly with the news flow we've seen in the last hour out of the greater Levant. And that, of course, stretches up to Turkey, Mr. Erdogan's Turkey, from Istanbul. And just one of our best bureaus worldwide, Oner Ant, joins us this morning. Oner, Mr. Erdogan is a most interesting voice in this war. I go back to early Erdogan, where I was in Istanbul a lot, and maybe it was more parochial, more domestic. And there was a middle Erdogan where he thought he could be the voice for the region. And now we have this war. Mr. Erdogan has made comments. Where does his voice fit in assisting in this war?
He's been very much in the middle of the pack in the sense that President Erdogan has been neutral, just like his foreign ministry so far, calling on both sides and is fighting both Israel and the militant group Hamas to basically end the hostilities without further loss of civilian lives. A bit unexpected from Erdogan, but yeah, he's been largely kept mum. And when he did speak, he was very neutral, unlike what you would expect from him in the past until recent years.
Although he did release a statement where he definitely was very critical of Israel, and there are some discussions that perhaps Turkey is housing some of the Hamas leaders that were involved in this attack. How much willingness is there on the part of Erdogan to work with certain nations to figure out where the leadership of Hamas is operating from and back Israel in any way?
Before Saturday's attacks, Turkey and Israel were in a process of normalizing their relationships. In fact, Netanyahu, after having to postpone his trip to Turkey over some domestic problems he was facing back in July, he was scheduled to visit Turkey and talk a bunch of issues, including energy collaboration with Erdogan, along with normalization of relationship between Turkey and Israel. As for Hamas, there has been no new statement from Ankara or the Turkish officials since Saturday's attacks, but we know that Hamas' presence in Istanbul has actually been downgraded massively over the last few months, and that was actually a precondition by Israel to start normalization process with Turkey. So we believe that if there are any Hamas officials left in Istanbul, the number of them is reduced in comparison to what was the case until a few months ago.
Oner, thank you so much. Oner on too short a visit from Istanbul this morning as we look south to the Gaza Strip and Israel. We now turn to the economy. We'll continue to monitor the events that we see. Futures deteriorating, negative 29. Brent crude, perhaps an emotional marker, up $3. Rounded up 4%, 87.73. Neil Dutta has been a great voice on the resiliency of the American economy. We haven't even mentioned the jobs report for one moment in this distracted Monday. Neil, and the moment the numbers came out, well, I thought of Neil Dutta because it was a Neil Dutta kind of report. As you dug deeper into the data, did that jobs report show the optimism, the resiliency of the American economic experiment?
Well, absolutely. That was, I think that's the right word, Tom, resilience. No jobs report is perfect. So in this case, the household survey was a bit weaker than the establishment survey. But when you look at the trend in employment, I mean, this is a strong labor market. We're adding, roughly 250,000 jobs a month on average over the last 3 months. The household survey is around 200,000 a month on average over that period. So, that's fine. And I think it's consistent. I mean, certainly the doves on the FOMC are going to have plenty of ammunition to make the case that this is consistent with a soft landing. The labor force is rising. Average hourly earnings, that's moderating. And so, the activity numbers are holding up. That's proxied by solid jobs growth. So I think they have everything they need to make the case to skip in November. So, the market, I think, is at 30% for a hike at the next FOMC meeting. I would take the under. I think the doves are gonna win that battle, and I think that's probably going to be the case in December as well. So you're going to go into the new year with the Fed not having done a thing at the last 3 meetings.
Neil, we would have been talking about the headline figure and parsing through some of the jobs data and then looking ahead to Thursday's CPI report. Instead, we're talking about the potential for geopolitical violence, geopolitical tensions just spewing up in the Middle East. At this point, how much are you factoring in higher oil prices and what that would do to a situation where we are seeing growth, but that it's fragile around the edges?
Well, I don't know that growth is as fragile as people are making it out to be. If anything, what's been fragile is the consensus forecasts of growth, because those have been getting revised up repeatedly. What's been stable has been the above trend growth in the economy. Now, obviously, we're all watching the developments overseas. I'm not a geopolitical analyst, but what I can tell you is, insofar as we're worried about oil prices, a couple of things to consider. Number one is the U.S. position as a major energy producer. We run a trade surplus in petroleum products. That's not something that we haven't been accustomed to it forever, really, in my career. That's number one. Number two is that even though oil, crude prices, Brent crude prices are rising today, it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot of disinflation in the pipeline at the retail pump that's coming for motorists over this month. I wouldn't be surprised to see, retail gasoline prices declining 50 cents in October. That's going to continue, Lisa. because of what we've seen in wholesale gasoline prices.
And there is that dynamic, Neil. I think on a broader level, people are trying to understand whether the ingredients are in the economy right now for a 1970s type of stagflation, given some of the growth, but also given what an oil shock would do to the current economy.
Well, I think the way to think about the oil shock so far is that we'll likely see more of an investment response than we will a consumption response. I mean, that's typically how it works. When we get a pickup in price, businesses tend to respond first. So I would expect to see rig counts beginning to turn around more quickly. And I wouldn't expect to see consumer spending slowing all that much, if at all. You talk about the stagflation risk. I mean, it's important to remember what the U.S. energy position was, what the nature of the economy was back then. It was much more manufacturing energy intensive than it is now. That doesn't mean, that stagflation can't happen. You can't rule out any scenario, but should that be the baseline right now?
Right.
I'm not so sure.
Neil Dutta with us, and we will continue. Futures deteriorate, negative 31. Dow down 200 points now. The VIX out 19.91. Lisa, Brent crude $88 a barrel. Standard & Poor's 500 down 0.7%.
Too short a time with Neil Dutta. Neil, I want to just have one last question to you as we parse and work toward that CPI on Thursday. How not positioned are equity investors or the broader markets to the prospect of even higher yields to come based on the growth that you're talking about?
Well, I think, it's important to kind of separate the short-run dynamics from the medium to longer-run dynamics. I think, you could probably talk me into a bullish case for equities, over the next few months, right? I mean, you have seasonality, which tends to be good, and the Fed is backing off. And the economy is holding up. So that's a pretty good recipe for the equity markets, at least for a trade. I would say it's a trade to rent, not necessarily own. And that goes to your point about higher interest rates. One of the things I'm struck by is that, there's still a, pervasive sense of optimism around the fixed income market. I think a lot of the people that wanted to buy, fixed income on the anticipation that yields would decline, they've already done so. So that kind of leaves only the sellers left. And we've obviously, blown through the top end of consensus estimates already in terms of rates. The consensus is offsides going into early next year. If you look at your own Bloomberg consensus, it's for basically flat growth in Q1 of 24. I would take the...
Neil, got to leave it there. Neil Dutta of Renaissance Macro, optimistic on the American economy. Coming up, the former World Bank president, Robert Zoellick. Perfectly timed. Stay with us on radio, on television. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning.
The line of the Middle East is unlike Las Vegas. What happens in the Middle East never stays in the Middle East. And the Biden administration will need to develop not only a strategy to address this issue, a strategy to see how this impacts existing programs such as the Iran and Saudi and other initiatives, but likewise, they're going to have to staff this out.
That was Norman Rule earlier this morning, senior advisor for the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as we were trying to parse through what transpired over the weekend with the attack on Israel by Hamas and then the subsequent retaliation and the conflicts that have been percolating out. We have seen risk aversion today. Tom, the bond market is closed. We heard earlier this morning from Amy Silverman that maybe it's helpful that the bond market is closed for the U.S. holiday, given the fact that stocks and you could see commodities trading somewhat in a vacuum separate from the yield space.
It is a vacuum today. There's no question about that. And we'll get information that I would say pay attention to Bloomberg out of Asia, Yvonne Manninol out of Hong Kong. This evening as maybe we get the beginning of a bond market open there and indications of that.
And what we can see with respect to specific stocks that are moving really is a response, as you would expect, where defense contractors are getting a huge leg up with people looking to where money will be flowing. Lockheed Martin shares up almost 5%. Northrop Grumman up about 3%. General Dynamics up 3.5%. So that knee-jerk reaction go into oil as well as some of the contractors and away from some of the riskier areas. There's a bigger question about what this means for the geopolitical community, Tom, and I think that that's really been a big question. How much of what we're seeing is a fissure of the world order that we knew and something that looks a little bit different? Someone with perspective, Robert Zoellick, joins us, former World Bank president, senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Robert, thank you so much for being with us. First, just your thoughts on what transpired over the weekend.
Well, this is a very traumatic event for Israel, as you see in the coverage. And it's a war. And we have to expect that, while dealing with a war with Russia and Ukraine, you now have another big front. As this is just not going to be a small retaliation by Israel. This is a problem now that they're going to have to figure out how to deal with, and it's going to go on for a while.
What's your impression of just how splintered some of the global order has become over the past couple of years, especially given that the allegiance with respect to Ukraine has been splintering, and now there's a question of who's going to work with who during this period of turmoil?
Well, you clearly have a much more fragmented system, and it adds to frictions, it adds costs. The World Bank, IMF annual meetings are beginning this week in Marrakesh. I'm sure they hoped that they could focus on Africa and the developing world, but the external environment is one that sort of creates wider anxiety across markets and frankly, the ability to cooperate. The U.S.-China tensions are very different than they were 10 years ago.
Robert Zoellick, across a span of decades, you are the single American most wired in to actually operating institutions and also creating policy with someone like James Baker and others. The singular feature I see now is a new isolationism in America. Witness half the jobs you used to appoint are vacant. Is America where we are now? We can't prosecute diplomacy because we have so many empty desks in our State Department and in other congressional administration cabinets?
Well, I think that's unfortunate. It hurts any administration's ability to operate, but I don't think that's the key issue. And I think as for the idea on isolationism, I think there's a mixed mood on this. The U.S. public understands the role internationally, but clearly the dysfunction that you've seen on the congressional side makes it harder for the executive branch to operate. But I think in general, the Biden administration tried to repair alliance relationships, which were obviously undercut during Trump's transactionalism. But some of these issues like the Middle East, you can just see how this will explode their effort to try to change the relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's likely to be one of the biggest.
Help us, Robert Zoellick, with Iran and the idea that you and I came out of school about the same time, and there was the shock, as we have a shock this morning, of 1979. How do you perceive the present day Iran and our ability to firmly negotiate with them, given the fury of Israel?
Well, frankly, I don't mean to be critical of the past, but I've always been skeptical of the idea you're going to be able to negotiate very effectively with this Iranian regime. As you know, they face great turmoil inside. This is not necessarily a stable situation. But when people were focusing on nuclear weapons, they also needed to focus on Iran's behavior in the region. And this is an example of this. I personally think that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad were the engines of this, but clearly they're cooperating with Hezbollah and Iran. So while I think the Biden administration has since wanted to pull back from the Middle East has forced itself back on their agenda.
Robert, this is a delicate question, but are you critical of the decision to release the $6 billion of funds to Iran and soften some of the sanctions that the U.S. had placed on that nation?
Well, I think I'd say at this point, the administration is going to have a hard time defending that decision. I understand some of the logic. I think, frankly, the administration and Israel, with the problems going on with the constitutional issues with Netanyahu, and for Iran's own reasons, kind of wanted to kick the can down the road. But this issue is firmly on the agenda, and I think they're going to have a hard time explaining what they did.
Your experiences within the State Department as well as the Trade Renegotiations Department leaves you in a fantastic position to really discuss where we are in terms of lack of positions filled, including the House Speaker, the fact that we are dealing, I mean, Tom was talking about some of the ambassadors, but there really is a feeling of dysfunction in the government. What would a government shutdown next month do to the U.S.'s ability to really step in this circumstance?
Well, I think the primary effect would be on the international perceptions of the United States. You used the word dysfunctionality. Look, the U.S. Constitution was not created for one branch to be able to run it. It's always a tension with the executive and the White House. But I think, and you can see, for example, the Senate trying to work with the White House, even though there are differences between the parties. I think what's happened in the House is of a different order. And it's partly a carry-on from some of the changes that Trump promoted and some of the styles that people have politically, where it's better to try to raise their profiles and raise money than to govern. So we'll see. The United States has gone through these types of crises before, and usually it ends up pushing the extremes further away. But that depends on what the Republicans in the House decide to do.
Robert Zoellick, to take your Illinois as an example, and to use President Trump's phrase, there are lots of Republicans in name only out there. You have represented decades of Republicans in name only. What should those people do given the polarities of America? How do we find the Zoellick middle ground?
Well, I don't consider myself in name only. I served in both elections and administrations, but I have a fundamental difference with the Trump approach. On domestic policy, on the Constitution, on the character of treatment. And I think if people object to what they see going on, they need to participate in the process. They need to vote. They need to be active in terms of their local communities. Look, when you look at a lot of the governors around the states, Republican and Democrat, that actually have to run something, a lot of these people are doing serious work. You got Republicans in New Hampshire, in Georgia, and other states that are having to work and govern effectively across the range of issues. So there is a strength of America. There's a resilience just as there is on the private economic side. But I don't underestimate the threat that's been created by the Trump phenomenon.
Right. Robert Zoellick, thank you so much. He's the former president of the World Bank. It was going to be on IMF World Bank. That went out the window, and you really wonder what the themes are going to be in Marrakesh as well. Lisa, I love your conversations today on the geography of Israel. As I said to the former ambassador, Mr. Demers, the triangulation here from Gaza over to the West Bank and up to the northern border with Lebanon is frightening.
With a couple of rockets fired over near the northern border, but not full Hezbollah engagement. Some of the imagery of the Iron Dome and how many rockets that were being fired and just exploding in the air. Amazing to see, and just imagine the noise of all of those explosions as people tried to shield themselves.
Into the evening in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and of course into the evening in the Gaza Strip. We'll continue with Bloomberg's coverage here of a war in Israel and the Gaza Strip, the war of Israel and Hamas. We continue our Bloomberg television coverage. Mr. Ferro, on the open, I would single out Henrietta Trays on the changed quarters of Washington on this Monday. Please stay with us on radio and television. Futures at -28. This is Bloomberg.